The wagon was stuck in the mud up to its axles. A man with a real sword at his belt was cursing in a language Dan shouldn't understand. But he understood every word. Dan just stood there with a shovel, staring at the ruined ruts and thinking the only thing a road engineer could possibly think about. Who built this? An hour earlier, he'd opened his eyes in the cold mud, spit out a clump of dirt, sat up. A strange gray sky. Trees too tall, too old. There aren't any like this in Oregon. There aren't any like this anywhere he's worked. A shovel lies nearby in the clay. An ordinary bayonet shovel. He doesn't remember where it came from. He doesn't remember anything at all. Just the headlights, a blow, and the silence after the blow. And then golden letters flash before his eyes. Route system active. Level 1. Clearing a path 50 meters. He rubs his eyes with his fist. The letters remain in place. Dan gets up, looks around, and realizes that the universe has taken everything from him. Life, home, peace, and left him with a shovel and a bad road. He laughs, because it's too accurate to take offense. He walks over to the stuck wagon. He pokes the ground with the shovel, loam with a high clay content. After rain, it turns to jelly. The rear axle has sagged, the load has shifted. Another 10 minutes and the wagon will tip over. Dan digs. He cuts away the mound. He fills the hole in front of the wheel. He tamps it down with his feet. He pats the bull on the rump. The wagon jumps out of the rut with a squelching sound. The man turns around, looks at Dan, then at the road, then back at Dan. He throws him a piece of bread and half a dried fish, and drives off. The system flashes. Experience gained, 3 points. Dan takes a bite of the bread. Stale, sour. The tastiest bread of his life, because it's the first he's earned in a world where it didn't exist just an hour ago. He walks along the path and counts, because even death can't turn off that habit. 2 meters wide. 2 carts can't pass each other. No pavement, no drainage. Rain washes the ruts all the way to the mainland. The path leads him to a village, 20 houses, thatched roofs, a dirty square with a well. No one looks at the dirty, barefoot vagrant. He sits down by the well, eats some bread, and falls asleep right on the ground, clutching his shovel close. The morning begins with a scream. The whole village has gathered at the well. The women are crying. In the center stands the gray-haired village elder, his voice trembling. His granddaughter, 8 years old, an infection inside. The herbalist turned pale and said that without a real doctor, the girl would die in 2 days. And the doctor lives 10 kilometers away. A trail through the forest. 8 hours of jolting over roots and potholes for a cart carrying a sick child. And everyone is crying because they know. The girl won't die from the illness. The girl's mind from the journey. And right then, a cold engineering fury rises inside Dan. The very same one that strikes every time people die because someone was too lazy. He pushes his way to the village elder and summons the system. A map unfolds before his eyes. The terrain, elevations. The trail zigzags, curves around a ravine, climbs a hill, descends, and winds around an old stream bed. Dan looks at the bed. It's dry. Completely dry. The stream dried up 100 years ago. The trail winds 10 kilometers around something that no longer exists. But if you cut straight across the bed, it's 2.5. On flat ground. A wagon would make it in 40 minutes. Dan opens his eyes and says he needs 8 men, 2 axes, 4 shovels, and 6 hours. The village head looks at the madman who showed up out of nowhere yesterday. But his granddaughter is dying, and there are no other options. He He nods. 20 minutes later, Dan is standing at the edge of the woods with 8 sullen men behind him. One holds an axe as if he's not aiming at the trees. Dan doesn't care. He studies the map and assigns tasks. 4 fell the trees, 2 clear the trunks, 2 level the ground. He leads the way and marks the path. His instincts tell him where the ground is firmer, where the roots are shallower, and where they can pass without cutting down trees. They work in silence, fiercely, quickly, because everyone knows why. 3 hours later, they reach the riverbed. Sand and gravel, compact, even. Nature has done half the work. But in 2 places, the riverbed is blocked by trees. The bank has collapsed and blocked the passage. And at the end, a wet spot. 30 meters of liquid mud where groundwater seeps to the surface. The cart will get stuck. The men are cutting through the blockages. Dan cuts down 3 young trees, lays them across, covers them with branches, fills the gap with gravel, and tamps it down. A rough causeway. It's not pretty, but it'll get us through. 6 hours later, he's standing at the exit of the ravine. It's now 2 kilometers to Hollowstead, not 10. The sun is setting when a wagon emerges from the forest with a bundled-up girl inside. Dan shows the way. The wheels roll smoothly. The ox doesn't stumble. 40 minutes later, the wagon reaches the path leading to the doctor. The girl survives. The doctor says that 1 more day, and it would have been too late. The village is silent. Then everyone turns to Dan. He sits by the well, eating porridge, and thinks there's nothing special about it. He just took a shortcut across the dry riverbed. Any freshman would have done the same thing after looking at a map. But in this world, no one looks at a map, because there is no map. The system flashes. Experience gained, 200 points. Level 2 reached, available. Soil assessment. B.A. drainage. The village looks at him as if he were a saint. But he is no saint. He is an engineer. And he knows that this path across the riverbed isn't a solution. It's a band-aid that the first heavy rain will turn into a swamp. The real solution is 10 kilometers of proper road. With drainage, with gravel, with a bridge over that rotten stream at the fork. The village head sits down next to him and says that Dan is now part of Bryn Mawr, that they'll give him a house, food, and clothes. Dan thanks him and asks if there's a quarry in the village. The village head is surprised. 3 kilometers to the north, there's an abandoned quarry. The stone is solid, but hauling it is a long way and expensive. Dan nods. 3 kilometers is exactly what he needs. In the evening, he sits in the designated hut and stares at the candle flame. In his past life, 10 kilometers of road meant project documentation, expert reviews, surveys, tenders, approvals from 20 agencies, millions of dollars, and 2 years of work. Here, he has a shovel, 8 men, and a girl who nearly died because the road was too long. That's enough. He blows out the candle. Tomorrow, the real work begins. In the morning, Dan headed north toward the abandoned quarry. Alone. With a shovel on his shoulder. The trail led through a sparse pine forest and was slightly better than yesterday's. Someone had once reinforced it with stones in the most treacherous spots, but the stones had long since sunk into the ground and stuck out of the earth like rotten teeth. An hour later, Dan reached the quarry. It was small, 50 meters long and 20 deep. The walls were steep. There was water at the bottom. But the rock outcrops on the upper ledges looked good. Dan climbed down and examined the rock. Granitoid, medium-grained, dense, moderate fracturing. Perfect for crushed stone. He called up the system. He asked for a rock assessment. The system showed that the compressive strength was approximately 150 megapascals. High frost resistance, low abrasion. Dan smiled. In Oregon, contractors would be fighting over such rock in bids. Here it lay forgotten, 3 kilometers from a village where people were wading knee-deep in mud. He walked back to the village and did the math. 10 kilometers of road, 4 meters wide. That's the minimum. A 20-centimeter thick base of compacted, crushed stone. That's about 8,000 cubic meters of stone. If each man crushes and hauls half a cubic meter a day, if he has 20 men, 400 workdays just for the gravel base, more than a year. That's without accounting for drainage, without bridges, without preparing the subgrade. The numbers were brutal. But Dan knew that numbers are always brutal at the start. Then people show up, then tools, then a rhythm, and the numbers change. The village headman was waiting for him in the village. A girl stood beside him, skinny, freckled, with scraped knees and eyes burning with such intense curiosity that Dan could almost physically feel it. The girl looked to be about 17 or 18. The village elder said she was his eldest granddaughter, Mira, the sister of the girl they'd taken to the doctor yesterday, and that Mira wanted to help. Dan looked at Mira. Mira looked at Dan. She said she'd seen him marking out the trail yesterday, that he looked at the ground as if he were reading a book, that she wanted to learn to read the ground too. Dan wanted to say that road construction wasn't for girls. Then he remembered that the 3 best geotechnical engineers he'd worked with in British Columbia were women, and that one of them once saved his life by spotting a crack in the slope that he had missed. He said he needed an assistant for the survey. Mira nodded so quickly she almost fell over. That same day, they set out on the route of the future road. Dan wanted to walk the entire route from Bryn Mawr to Hollowstead on foot, not along the old trail, but along the route the system had suggested. The optimal route ran south of the old trail. It skirted the hill from the east rather than from the west. It crossed the stream at its narrowest point, and it passed through a relatively flat clearing that Dan mentally named the Middle Field. The total length of the route turned out to be not even 10, but 8.5 kilometers. They walked, and Dan explained. Mira listened. He showed her the slope and explained why a road needs a cross slope, so that water flows into the ditch and doesn't pool on the surface. Mira asked why all the roads she knows are flat. Dan replied that that was why all the roads she knew were muddy. Mira thought about it. Then she said that it was very simple and very silly at the same time, that people had been building roads for 300 years and no one had thought to slope them to one side. Dan didn't mention that in his world they'd figured that out thousands of years ago. Halfway there, they came to a stream, the very one Dan had walked past yesterday, the very one with the rotten bridge made of 3 logs. Dan stopped and stared at the banks for a long time. The stream was 4 meters wide, about half a meter deep. The current was weak. The bottom was rocky. The banks were gentle on one side and steep on the other. The system showed him the substrate beneath the water. Gravelly loam. Compact. Sufficient load-bearing capacity for a stone bridge. Dan sat down on the bank and began drawing with a stick on the ground. Mira sat down next to him. He was drawing a bridge. Not one made of 3 logs, a real bridge. A single-span bridge. A stone arch. 5 meters wide. The arch was 2 meters high, with stone parapets on either side. Mira looked at the drawing. She asked who would build it. Dan said he didn't know yet, but that the stone in the quarry was suitable for the arch, and that he'd seen 3 men in the village who knew how to hew stone. Mira shook her head. She said there were stonemasons in Stone Ridge. Far to the east, there were whole families there who had been building bridges and walls for generations. But there was no work. Trade had died. The roads had rotted away. The stonemasons are begging or joining the army. Dan remembered that. Stone Ridge. Stonemasons. They reached Hollowstead by evening. The town was 5 times the size of Bryn Mawr. 100 houses, a market, a tavern, a doctor's house with a carved porch, a palisade around the perimeter, 2 guards at the gate. Dan and Mira entered without any trouble. The guards glanced at them with lazy indifference. Just 2 more vagabonds. At the market, Dan saw what he was looking for. Tools. A blacksmith shop at the edge of the square was selling pickaxes and crowbars. The prices were insane. A single pickaxe cost as much as a peasant family spent in 2 weeks. Dan had no money, not a single coin. He stood by the shop and thought. He needed tools, lots of tools. Pickaxes for breaking stone, for uprooting stumps, wheelbarrows for hauling, hammers for chiseling. Without these, no road is possible. He could dig with a shovel forever, but you can't build a bridge with a shovel. Mira tugged at his sleeve. She pointed to the opposite end of the square. There stood a middle-aged man in fine clothes, leather boots, a belt with a silver buckle, an embroidered coat of arms on his jacket, some merchant or official. Mira said it was Grant Wallace, the steward of Baron Halford, the very same baron who owns the lands from Brynmore to Hollowstead and another 50 kilometers to the east. Grant Wallace comes to Hollowstead once a month. He collects taxes, he checks the supplies, and leaves. Dan thought for a minute. Then he went up to Wallace. Mira tried to stop him. She said that ordinary people don't approach the Baron's steward, that it could end badly. Dan didn't stop. He walked up to Wallace and spoke. He said he was a roadmaster, that he wants to build a road from Brynmore to Hollowstead. A real road, paved, with a bridge, and that he needs tools. Wallace looked at him the way one looks at a talking dog, with interest and distrust at the same time. He asked who he was, where he came from, who was backing him. Dan replied that he was on his own, that he had come from distant lands, and that he knew how to build roads that didn't turn to mud after the rain. Wallace laughed. He said there was no such thing as roads like that even the imperial highways turned to mud, and that Dan was either crazy or a con artist. Dan proposed a bet. He said he would build 100 meters of road at the northern gate of Hollowstead in 3 days, out of local stone. If the road withstood the first rain without a single puddle, Wallace would lend him tools. If not, Dan would work for the Baron for free for a month. Wallace looked at him for a long time. Then he smiled. He said he'd take the bet, because a free worker always comes in handy. They shook hands. Dan and Mira returned to Brynmore that night. They walked along a cut path through a dry riverbed. Mira stumbled in the darkness. Dan walked with confidence. The system illuminated the path with a thin golden line, a new feature. He hadn't asked for it. The system had given it to him on its own. The next morning, Dan gathered 6 men and explained the task. They had to haul as many stones as they could from the quarry to the northern gates of Hollowstead in 2 days. The men were the same ones who had worked with him clearing the riverbed. They trusted him exactly as much as one can trust a man who saved the village elder's child. And they began hauling. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dan stood at the northern gates of Hollowstead. Before him lay a pile of stones, small ones, medium ones, large ones, a chaotic heap from which 100 meters of road had to be built. Wallace came to watch. He stood to the side. He crossed his arms over his chest. Dan began by digging 2 parallel trenches on either side of the future road. Drainage ditches, 30 centimeters deep, 40 wide, sloping away from the road. Then he dug out the soil from the roadbed to a depth of 20 centimeters. The dullest, hardest work, just digging and throwing the dirt aside. 6 men were digging. Dan was marking out the line. Mira carried the stakes for marking. By noon, the trench was ready. Then Dan explained to the men what fractions were, that the stones needed to be broken into 3 sizes. Large ones, about the size of a fist, for the bottom layer. Medium ones, about the size of an egg, for the middle. Small ones, about the size of a walnut, for the top. The men exchanged glances. One asked why. Dan picked up 3 stones of different sizes. He placed the large one down, the medium one on top, the small one on top of that. He pressed down with his foot. The stones didn't budge. Then he picked up 3 stones of the same size. He placed them. He pressed down. The stones spread apart. The man nodded. There were no more questions. They crushed stone until evening. They crushed stone all the next day. On the third day, Dan began laying the foundation, the bottom layer. Large stones packed tightly together, medium-sized stones on top, then small ones. Dan tamped down each layer. In his world, a vibrating roller was used for tamping. Here, he had 6 men with wooden mallets and a log that they lifted and dropped. It took a long time. It was hard work, but it worked. By sunset on the third day, 100 meters of road were ready. Dan stood at the edge and watched. The road was rough, uneven by the standards of his world. No comparison to asphalt. But it was right. The surface had a 2% cross slope. Water drained into the ditches. The stones were laid by size and tamped down. The base was 10 centimeters higher than the surrounding soil. Wallace walked over. He looked. He said nothing. Dan was silent too. It started raining 2 days later, a cold autumn downpour. It rained for 6 hours. Hollowstead Square turned into a swamp. The path to the south gate became a river. But the 100 meters of road by the north gate remained dry. Water ran down the surface into the ditches. The stones hadn't budged. Not a single puddle. Wallace came out in the rain. He stood on the road. He stamped his feet. He looked down at his feet. He looked at Dan, who was standing next to him, wet and muddy, with a shovel in his hands. And he said the tools would be ready tomorrow. 10 pickaxes, 5 crowbars, 3 wheelbarrows, 2 stone hammers. On credit. Secured by future work on the Baron's lands. Dan nodded. Mira stood nearby, soaked to the skin. She was smiling so widely that the freckles on her face blurred into a single solid patch. That evening, at the village headman's house, Dan sat by the fire drying his clothes. Mira brought him some hot soup. The headman sat across from him and said nothing. Then he asked how long it would take to build a proper road to Hollowstead. Dan replied that 3 months, if there are 20 workers, if someone hauls the stone from the quarry with a cart, if there is no war or plague, 3 months. The village headman nodded. He said he would gather the men, that there are 23 households in Bryn Mawr, 1 man from each household for the construction site. The wives would provide food. Junfred would haul the stone with his ox, the very same man with the cart whom Dan had helped on the first day. Dan thanked him. He lay down on the mattress. He closed his eyes, and he thought that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this way. Needed. Truly needed. Not like an employee who can be replaced, not like a contractor who is hired and fired, but like a man without whom children die. Construction began on the 4th day after the bet. Dan went out onto the road with 20 men from Bryn Mawr and staked out the first kilometer. The work was simple and terrifying at the same time. Simple because it involved repeating the same steps over and over. Remove the top layer of soil, dig ditches on either side, lay large stones, medium-sized, small, tamp it down, next section. Terrifying because the scale was overwhelming, 8.5 kilometers. Every meter meant 2 cubic meters of stone that had to be quarried, crushed, hauled, laid. 20 men, 1 cart, 1 ox. The first week was the hardest. The men worked but didn't understand why it had to be so difficult. Why 3 layers when 1 would do? Why ditches if it's going to rain anyway? Why tamp it down if the stone is already in place? Dan explained, over and over. He demonstrated. He drew with a stick on the ground. Mira translated his explanations into simple language because Dan would sometimes get carried away and start using terms that didn't exist here. She told the men that water was the road's main enemy, that if water wasn't allowed to flow down and to the side, it would destroy the stone in a single winter. That 3 layers were like 3 walls. 1 can be broken through, 3 cannot. The men listened. They didn't always believe her, but they worked. Because they'd seen those 100 meters at the Hollowstead gate. Because carts had already driven over them and no one had gotten stuck. By the end of the 2nd week, the 1st kilometer was ready. Dan stood on it and looked. The road ran from the outskirts of Bryn Mawr to the southeast, 4 meters wide, with ditches on both sides, with a surface of compacted gravel. Rough, imperfect, but real. The system flashed. Experience gained, 500 units. Level 3 reached. Available. Load-bearing capacity calculation. Culvert design. Dan read the description of the new features. Load-bearing capacity calculation allowed the system to more accurately determine which soil could withstand which load. Culvert design opened up the possibility of building drainage under the road and not just on the sides. Useful. Very useful. Especially for the section through the low-lying area where water pooled. The first problem arose in the 3rd week. Junfrid broke a wheel on the wagon. The stone from the quarry stopped coming in. Construction ground to a halt. The men sat around with nothing to do. Dan thought for 2 hours. Then he went to Hollowstead. He found a wheelwright, an old man, crooked fingers, but sharp eyes and precise work. The wheel cost money that Dan didn't have, but Dan offered the wheelwright a deal. The new road to Bryn Mawr meant that customers from the 7 villages to the north would be able to come to him. Right now, they don't come because the trail is impassable for half the year. The wheelwright would get more work, more money. All Dan was asking for was that 1 wheel now, and wheel repairs in the future, at a fair price. The master thought it over. He scratched his beard. Then he agreed. The wheel was ready by evening. In the 4th week, Dan faced what he had expected and feared. The road came to a section where the land belonged not to the village, but to Baron Halford. Formally, all the land belonged to the Baron, but the Baron didn't touch the village lands. The land between the villages, however, was considered his personal territory. Building on it without permission meant asking for trouble. Mira said that Wallace had surely reported the road to the Baron, that the Baron would either send his man with permission or with a ban. They had to wait. Dan didn't like waiting, but he understood that in this world, the land belonged to whoever had the longer sword, and Dan didn't have a sword. They waited 3 days. On the 4th day, a horseman arrived from Hollowstead, a young man in the uniform of the Baron's guard. He brought a letter from Wallace. Baron Halford agreed to the construction of the road through his lands, on 3 conditions. First, the road is open to the Baron's people free of charge and at any time. Second, Dan undertakes to maintain the road at his own expense. Third, the Baron receives the right to collect a toll from the merchant caravans that will use the road. Dan read the letter. The first 2 conditions were acceptable. The third was not. If the Baron charged a toll, the merchants simply wouldn't come. Why pay twice, for the goods and for the road? Dan wrote a reply, by himself. Mira helped with the writing because Dan hadn't mastered the local alphabet yet. He offered the Baron an alternative. The toll would be collected not by the Baron, but by the road fund. Half would go toward road maintenance, a quarter to the Baron, a quarter to Bryn Mawr. And the toll would be fixed, 1 coin per cart, not a percentage of the cargo, a fixed rate, so that merchants would know in advance how much the passage cost and could calculate their expenses. The reply came a week later. The Baron agreed. Dan suspected that Wallace had convinced him. Wallace was a smart man. He saw the road. He understood that it would work.
And he understood that a quarter of something is better than all of nothing.
Construction continued. The second kilometer went more smoothly. The men already knew the order of the work. They no longer asked why the ditches were needed. They were already sorting the stones by size themselves. Dan noticed that one of the men, a sturdy guy in his 20s named Tarek, was working faster and more precisely than the rest. He placed each stone as if he knew exactly where it belonged. Dan walked over to him and asked how he knew how to lay the stones. Tarek shrugged. He said his grandfather used to build ovens, that a stone is a stone. It tells you where it wants to go. You just have to listen. Dan looked at Tarek and thought that in another world, this guy would be an engineer. Here, he's a peasant who lays stones on the road for food. By the end of the second month, the road had reached the stream. 3.5 kilometers of finished pavement, smooth, level, dry after every rain. Carts from Bryn Mawr reached the stream in half an hour. Before, the same road took 2 hours. Now a bridge was needed. And here Dan came up against the limits of his abilities. He knew how to design bridges, in theory. He had seen thousands of bridges. He knew the principles of load calculation and force distribution in an arch. But he had never built a bridge with his own hands. He was a road engineer, not a bridge builder. The system helped. It showed the optimal shape of the arch. It calculated the loads. But the system didn't lay the stones. The stones had to be laid by someone who knew how to do it. Dan remembered what Mira had said. Stone Ridge, the Masons, families of bridge builders. But Stone Ridge was far away, 200 kilometers to the east, along roads that didn't exist. He couldn't abandon the construction site and go looking for a master. The solution came from where he least expected it. A boy from the village of Craigmore arrived at the construction site, a small settlement 5 kilometers west of Bryn Mawr. The boy said his father had heard about the new road, that their village wanted one too, and that they had a stonemason, an old master who had built bridges for the Baron 20 years ago and then found himself out of work. The stonemason's name was Bran. He was nearly 60. His hands were shaky. His back was bent. But when he looked at the sketch of the bridge that Dan had drawn in the mud with a stick, his eyes lit up. He said the arch was too shallow, that with a span of that width, a steeper rise was needed, otherwise the keystone wouldn't hold. Dan looked at the drawing, then at the system's calculations, then at Bran, and realized the old man was right. The system calculated the load for a perfect stone. But a stone from the quarry isn't perfect. It has cracks and irregularities. It's a living stone, not a mathematical model. Bran knew this because he'd held thousands of stones in his hands. Dan changed the design. Bran nodded. They began building the bridge. Bran directed the laying of the stones. Dan calculated and handed them over. Tarek hewn the stones. Mira recorded all the dimensions and proportions in a notebook she had sewn together from scraps of leather. Dan asked why she was writing it down. Mira replied that someone had to remember how to build bridges when Bran died. Dan fell silent, because she was absolutely right. It took 3 weeks to build the bridge, 12 rows of stone, an arch made of wedge-shaped blocks, a keystone weighing 300 kilograms that 8 men hoisted using wooden pulleys. When the pulleys were removed, the arch stood. Bran placed his hand on the stone. He stood there for a minute. Then he turned to Dan and said that this was his last bridge, and that it was a good one. Dan replied that it wasn't his bridge, it was Bran's bridge. He had only counted. The old man smiled. He said that counting was harder than building. They named the bridge after the headman of Bryn Mawr, Elvin's Bridge, because it was his granddaughter who started all this, because without the little girl's illness, Dan wouldn't have cleared the path. Without the path, he wouldn't have come to Bryn Mawr. Without Bryn Mawr, there would be no road. The life of a single child set in motion a chain of events that has now stretched 3.5 kilometers of stone. The system flashed. Construction complete. Elvin's Bridge. Experience gained 1,000 units. Level 4. Unlocked. Arch bridge design. Soil reinforcement. Dan stood on the bridge and looked at the water below. 4 meters. A single span. A tiny bridge by any measure, but the first one, and it stands. And tomorrow, wagons will travel across it. And he will go further, because there are still 5 kilometers ahead to Hollowstead. And this is just the beginning. Dan spent another 6 weeks building the last 5 kilometers of road to Hollowstead. The work picked up speed. 10 men from Craigmore joined the 20 from Brynmore. Bran brought his nephew along, who turned out to be a capable mason. Yunfred repaired a wagon and began making 2 trips a day. And 3 guys came from Hollowstead who just wanted to check out the construction site and ended up staying. For food. No questions asked. For the first time, Dan realized that the work itself was what drew people in. Not money, not orders. People saw the road growing. They saw wagons traveling on it. They saw that the rain didn't turn it into a swamp, and they wanted to be part of it. The 3rd month was the month of the lowlands. The 2-kilometer stretch between the stream and the climb up to Hollowstead ran through a wet plain. Not a swamp, but close. The groundwater was half a meter below the surface. After rain, the ground squelched underfoot. A normal road would have been flooded here within a month. Dan spent 3 days studying the section. He walked around with a shovel. He dug test pits. He examined the soil. The system showed the water level and soil density. There were 2 options. First, go around the lowland from the south, plus 2 kilometers, no water problems. Second, go straight through, but on an embankment. Raise the road a meter above ground level. That would require a lot of stone and earth, a great deal. Dan chose the embankment, because 2 extra kilometers are 2 extra kilometers forever. Every cart, every traveler, every time would pass over them for no reason. An embankment is built once, but saves time forever. The men hauled stone and earth for 2 weeks. The embankment's foundation was made of large stones, then a layer of small stones, then clay, packed down until it rang, then more gravel, the surface. Ditches. Dan added a new element, culverts. 3 of them over 2 kilometers. Short stone tunnels under the road through which water could flow freely from one side of the embankment to the other. Without the pipes, water would pool at the base and wash it away. With the pipes, it flowed right through and drained into the ditch. The men looked at the pipes and shook their heads. Why put holes in the road? That weakens it. Dan explained that water is stronger than stone, that if you don't give the water a path, it will find one on its own, and the path it finds will go right through their road. They built. Dan calculated. Mira took notes. Bran grumbled that in his day, bridge builders didn't bother with ditches. Tarek silently laid the stones, each in its place. By the middle of the 3rd month, the embankment was ready. 2 kilometers of road on a 1-meter-high embankment across the lowland. Dan stood on it and felt a pride he couldn't afford, because there were still another 1.5 miles to go, and the climb up to Hollowstead. The climb was the problem. Hollowstead stood on a hill. An old trail led up to it at an angle Dan estimated to be 15 degrees. It was hard for a pedestrian. For a loaded cart, it was nearly impossible. Every winter, carts overturned on this climb. Dan asked the system for options. The system suggested a serpentine route. Instead of a straight, head-on ascent, the road made 2 gentle turns and climbed the slope at an angle of 6 degrees. The length of the route increased by 400 meters, but the gradient decreased by almost a third. Any cart could make it. The men didn't understand why they would make the road longer when it could be shorter. Dan took a wheelbarrow. He loaded it with stones. He rolled it straight up the hill. After 20 meters, he stopped, because the wheelbarrow was impossible to push. Then he rolled the same wheelbarrow along the marked serpentine path. He rolled it all the way to the top without stopping. The men watched. Then they started digging the serpentine path. Dan finished the last section to the Hollowstead Gate on the last day of the 3rd month, just as he had promised. 8.5 kilometers, 1 bridge, 1 embankment, 3 culverts, a serpentine road on the ascent, and not a single puddle after the 3 rains that fell during construction. Dan stood at the Hollowstead Gate and looked at the road leading northwest, toward Bryn Mawr, toward the village where he'd woken up face down in the mud 3 months ago. Mira stood beside him, dirty as always, a leather notebook pressed to her chest. The notebook contained all the blueprints, all the measurements, all the proportions of the bridge's arch, all the angles of the serpentine road. She said that someday thousands of people would travel along this road. Dan replied that at least 10 would do for a start. Wallace arrived the next day. He brought 2 men with him. One turned out to be the Baron's clerk. The other was a merchant from Ertania who had been stuck in Hollowstead for a month because of impassable roads in the north. The merchant had walked the new road to Bryn Mawr and back, an hour and a half each way. He returned with the same look on his face that Dan had seen on the contractors' faces when they were shown the new technology. A mixture of delight, envy, and greedy calculation. The merchant asked Dan how much it would cost to build such a road further on, southward, to the coast. 200 kilometers. Dan almost laughed. 200 kilometers. It had taken him 3 months for 8.5 kilometers. 30 men, 1 ox. The merchant waited for an answer. Dan said he'd get back to him later, because he needed to do the math. The merchant's name was Ricardo Ben. He was from the Ben Trading House, a mid-sized firm, not the richest, not the poorest, but smart. Ricardo understood that a road from Hollowstead to the coast would give him an advantage over his competitors that money couldn't buy. Speed, reliability, predictability. A caravan that always arrives is always more valuable than one that arrives only sometimes. Ricardo offered financing. He would pay for the tools, food for the workers, materials that can't be sourced locally, iron for tools and nails, ropes, fabric for tents. In return, he wants 5 years of free passage on all the roads Dan builds, and the right of first caravans on every new road. Dan thought about it for 3 days. 5 years of free passage is a lot. But tools and food are the difference between a construction site and starvation, between 30 workers and 100, between 8 kilometers in 3 months and 20. He agreed with one change. Not 5 years, 3 years. And not for free, but at half price. Ricardo haggled as naturally as he breathed. They settled on 4 years and a third of the price. Mira sat nearby and wrote down the terms. Dan thought he needed someone to handle the money and contracts, because he was an engineer, not a merchant, and every hour spent haggling was an hour taken away from the road. But that person would come later. For now, Dan was sitting in the Hollowstead Tavern, drinking beer. His first beer in this world, bitter and cloudy, but cold. And he looked at the map the system was showing him. The map had expanded. Now he could see not just the area around Bryn Mawr, he could see the entire region. 200 kilometers in every direction. Roads, trails, rivers, mountains, towns, villages. Most of the roads were red. That meant impassable or dangerous. Some were yellow. Difficult, but possible. There wasn't a single green one, except for one small green line in the northwest, 8.5 kilometers from Bryn Mawr to Hollowstead. His road. The only green line on the map within 200 kilometers. Dan finished his beer. He set down the mug, and he thought he needed more green. Much more. That evening in Bryn Mawr, the village headman was waiting for him, and 4 other people Dan didn't know. The headmen of the neighboring villages, Craigmore, Fenwood, Thornhill, Middlebrook. 4 villages that had heard about the road. 4 villages that wanted one just like it. The village headman of Craigmore spoke first. 5 kilometers from Craigmore to the Bryn Mawr Road, Hollowstead. If Dan built a branch road, their village would provide 15 workers and a stone from their own quarry, which is closer than the one in Bryn Mawr. The village elder of Fenwood offered timber, good construction-grade pine for bridges and beams, and 10 workers. Thornhill offered clay for bricks. Middlebrook. Food, grain and salted meat for the workers. Dan listened and felt as a network forming in his head. Not a road network, not yet. A network of people, resources, interests. Bryn Mawr provides labor and stone. Craigmore provides stone and workers. Fenwood provides timber. Thornhill provides clay. Middlebrook provides food. If you connect all 5 villages with roads, you get a cluster, a small economy of 5 points. Each gives what it has and receives what it lacks. He looked at the map in his head and saw a star, Bryn Mawr in the center. 5 rays to 5 points. Hollowstead as the 6th, a trade route to the south. 30 kilometers of roads, 6 months of work, maybe less if the resources from the 5 villages are combined. Dan stood up. He looked at the 5 village elders and said he would build all 5 roads, but not for free. Each village provides labor and materials. Each village gets a road. Each village pays a toll for the passage of other people's wagons. The money goes toward maintaining the entire network, not just one road, but all of them. Because if one road falls apart, the network works worse. The village elders exchanged glances. They weren't used to thinking in terms of networks. Each village lived on its own, for itself, alone against everyone else. The idea that 5 villages were a single whole was strange to them, almost frightening. But they saw the road, and they saw a merchant from Myrtania drive along it, and they knew that this merchant would pay a coin for passage and buy something in their village, and another merchant, and another. They agreed. Not all at once. The village elder of Thornhill hesitated the longest, but when the other 4 nodded, he nodded too, because being left alone on an impassable trail when the neighbors have a road is worse than paying a toll. Dan shook 5 hands. Mira wrote down the terms, and Dan thought he definitely needed someone to handle the money and paperwork, because 5 villages meant 5 contracts, 5 streams of resources, 5 work schedules, 5 points where something could go wrong. He's an engineer. He should be building, but here he is, sitting and haggling. At night, he lay on his mattress and stared at the ceiling. The system glowed a quiet gold in the darkness. It displayed a map, his little green line on a huge red continent. Dan closed his eyes and thought about the turns, about that turn in Oregon that killed him, about how no one listened for 3 years, about how easy it would have been to put up a guardrail and adjust the grade. 10 hours of work, $5,000, and he'd still be alive. It's the same here. People die from things that could be fixed. Children don't make it to the doctor. Merchants don't make it to the market. Armies don't reach the border. All because of the roads, because of the lack of roads. He rolled onto his side. He pulled the shovel close to him. It had been leaning against the wall, but he'd moved it closer, because the shovel was the only object from that first moment, the first thing this world had given him. And he fell asleep. Building the road junction around Bryn Mawr took 4 months. 40 workers from 5 villages, stone from 2 quarries, timber from Fenwood, clay from Thornhill, food from Middlebrook. Dan divided the construction into 5 phases. Each village built its own road to Bryn Mawr simultaneously with the others. It was risky. 5 crews, 5 sites, and 1 Dan who had to keep an eye on everyone. He was torn in 2. In the morning, at the Craigmore site, he checked the laying. By noon, he was rushing to Fenwood to watch them lay a pipe across the ravine. In the evening, he returned to Bryn Mawr and calculated the stone consumption. At night, he drew up plans for the next day. He slept 4 hours. Mira slept even less. She was at all 5 sites. In the morning with 1 crew. After lunch, she was with another. She handed out the blueprints. She checked the slopes with a homemade level that Dan had made from a board and a bowl of water. She corrected mistakes. She argued with the men who were laying the stone crookedly. She was 19. She was bossing men twice her age around, and they listened. Not right away. For the first 2 weeks, the men from Thornhill refused to work under a girl. Dan came. He looked at the site. He pointed out 3 mistakes in the laying that Mira had been noting for 2 days. The men hadn't corrected them because they weren't listening to the girl. Dan said that if they didn't listen to Mira, they wouldn't listen to him. Because Mira speaks his words, and that he'd pull the crew off the site and Thornhill would be left without a road. The guys fixed the mistakes. After that, they didn't argue with Mira anymore. In the 6th week of construction, what Dan had feared happened. An accident on the Middlebrook site. A stone fell off a wheelbarrow and rolled down the slope. The man didn't have time to jump out of the way. A broken leg. Clean break. No displacement. But he won't be able to work for 2 months. Dan stood over the injured man and thought. In his world, construction sites have hard hats, barriers, safety instructions, insurance. Here, there's nothing. Just people and stone. He gathered all 5 crews in Bryn Mawr. He spent the whole day explaining how to lift stones, how to secure wheelbarrows on the slope, how to stand while loading, where a stone might come from, where to run if something went wrong. The men listened. Some grimaced, as if to say, "Don't lecture us. We were hauling rocks before you were even born." Dan didn't argue. He just demonstrated. He picked up a 20-kilogram rock. He lifted it the wrong way, back straight and knees bent. Then he lifted it the right way. He asked a guy twice his size to repeat both methods. The guy did. His back cracked on the wrong lift. Not badly, but enough for everyone to hear. After that, they listened more carefully. Dan established a rule. Every morning before work, the foreman checks the tools. Every evening, the crew inspects the worksite for the next day. Every guy knows where the 2 closest to him are. If someone goes missing, everyone stops and looks for him. The guys called these Dan's rules. Dan called it common sense. But common sense was a rarity in this world. Here, people were used to the idea that a construction site was a place where people got maimed and died. That it was normal. That the stone takes its toll. Dan didn't buy that logic. The stone doesn't take a toll. The stone just lies there. People make their own mistakes, and mistakes can be prevented. In the 8th week, the first winter of his new life arrived. The cold hit early. The ground froze solid in 3 days. Digging became impossible. Dan halted construction. The men scattered to the villages. Mira sat in Dan's house and copied her notes into a clean notebook. The leather-bound notebook had swollen to the thickness of a fist. blueprints, calculations, gravel proportions, slope angles, dimensions of culverts. Dan looked at that notebook and thought it was the most valuable object within a 100-kilometer radius, because it contained knowledge. Not magical, not secret, just knowledge of how to build roads that work. Winter gave Dan time to think. He sat by the stove and studied the map of the system. The system expanded his field of view with each level. Now he could see nearly 500 kilometers in every direction, and he saw patterns. 3 major cities formed a triangle in the center of the region. Lowhaven, on the coast, a port city, merchant ships, fish, salt, imports from the south. Caldor, deep in the interior, an agricultural hub, grain, livestock, flax. Stone Ridge in the foothills, a mining town, stone, ore, coal, about 120 kilometers between them. The roads between them were red, impassable. This meant that the port could not sell fish inland, that grain from the fields did not reach the coast, that stone from the mountains did not reach the plain. 3 cities, 3 resources, 3 dead ends. If you connect them with roads, you get a triangle. The Great Triangle. 360 kilometers of roads, bridges, embankments, winding roads. Years of work, hundreds of people. But the result? The result will change everything. Fish from the coast to Caldor in 2 days instead of 2 weeks. Grain from Caldor to Stone Ridge in 3 days instead of a month. Stone from Stone Ridge to Lowhaven in 4 days instead of never. Prices will fall. Famine will recede. Trade will revive. People will stop dying because medicine didn't make it. Dan drew diagrams with charcoal on the wall of his house. By spring, the wall was black with drawings. Mira came every day and copied them into a notebook. She was silent while she worked. Only sometimes did she ask what this or that line meant. Dan explained. She nodded. She wrote it down. Once she asked why he was building roads, not how. Why? Dan thought for a moment. Because he knows how. Because there's no one else here. Because he sees people who need a road. Mira shook her head. She said that wasn't an answer. That many people know how to do something useful but don't do it. That the question isn't about ability, but about reason. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said that in his old world, the roads were bad too. Not as bad, but bad enough that people died. And that he had asked for one road to be repaired for 3 years, and no one listened to him. And that later, that road killed him. Mira looked at him for a long time. Then she said that he was building roads because he didn't want it to be like that here. Dan didn't answer, because she was right. Winter ended at the beginning of the 4th month. The ground thawed, construction resumed, and it was finished by the middle of the 6th month of his life in this world. 32 kilometers of roads, 6 settlements connected in a star pattern with Bryn Mawr at the center. 3 bridges. Bran built 2 of them. The 3rd was built by his nephew under Bran's supervision. 8 culverts, 1 serpentine road, 1 embankment, 0 fatalities. The system flashed. Road network. Bryn Mawr cluster. Registered. Level 5 reached. New ability. Road stations. Dan read the description. Road stations are points along the route where travelers can stop, rest, eat, change horses, get information about the road ahead. The system allowed them to be designed and marked on the map, but people had to build and maintain them. That was right. A road without people is just stones on the ground. People bring the road to life. Ricardo Ben arrived a week after completion. He brought 3 wagons of goods from the coast.
cloth, salt, dried fish, spices. He had traveled from the coast to Hollowstead for 14 days, along the old trails, with an escort, losing one wagon in the river. From Hollowstead to Bryn Mawr on the new road, he made it in 2 hours, without an escort, without any losses. He stood in Bryn Mawr Square and looked at his wagons. All 3 were intact. All the sacks were dry. All the barrels were in place. Then he looked at Dan and said he was ready to finance the Great Triangle, right now, no matter the cost. Dan shook his head. He said he wasn't ready, that 32 kilometers of country roads and 360 kilometers of highways were 2 different things. That he needed specialists, masonry workers for the bridges, real masonry workers, not country folk, logistics experts for supplies, security for the builders because there are bandits on the major highways, a cartographer to map out the exact route, and someone to handle the finances, because Dan can no longer count stones and count money at the same time. Ricardo asked what Dan wanted first and foremost. Dan answered without hesitation, masonry workers, from Stone Ridge. Ricardo nodded. He said he had contacts in Stone Ridge, that he'd send someone. Dan thanked him. Then he stepped out onto the road. He stood on the stones he had laid 4 months ago, the first kilometer, already darkened by the rain, already grown into the ground, already familiar. A woman with a basket of apples was walking along them, from Fenwood to Hollowstead, to the market. 3 hours ago, that would have been impossible. The apples from Fenwood had been rotting on the trees because there was no way to transport them. Now the woman was walking along the smooth road carrying apples to the market. And she wasn't thinking about it, because a good road is a road you don't think about. Dan watched the woman with the apples, and he thought about the Great Triangle, about 360 kilometers, about the towns it would connect, about the people who would travel on his roads, and about the fact that winter was coming, the second winter in this world, and that he had to be ready by spring, because in the spring, the real work would begin. Everything that had come before was just a warm-up. Spring arrived wet and vicious. 2 weeks of non-stop rain turned everything around Bryn Mawr into a mess. Everything except Dan's roads. They held firm. Water ran off into the ditches. The ditches carried the water into the ravines. The stone held. It was the best advertisement Dan could have imagined. Every traveler who drove down his road in the rain and didn't get stuck told the story in the next village. And the next. And the next. By the 3rd week of spring, people began arriving in Bryn Mawr. Not from neighboring villages, from far away, from places Dan hadn't even heard of. The first to arrive was a messenger from Baron Halford. Not from Wallace, from the Baron himself. The letter was short. The Baron invited Dan to his castle for a conversation. No further details. Mira read the letter and turned pale. She said that when the Baron invites someone, it's not an invitation, it's an order, and that people who refused to visit the Baron sometimes disappeared. Dan thought about it. Then he wrote a reply. He thanked the Baron for the invitation and suggested that the Baron come himself, because the road to Halford Castle is only passable on horseback, and Dan doesn't know how to ride a horse. But the road from the castle to Bryn Mawr via Hollowstead is now passable by carriage. Mira read the reply, and her hands were shaking. She said that Dan was crazy, that the Baron would take it as an insult, that he would send soldiers. Dan shrugged. He said that if the Baron sent soldiers, the soldiers would see the road, and they'll tell the Baron. And the Baron will come anyway, because the Baron is a merchant, and merchants go where the money is. A week passed. The soldiers didn't come. Wallace arrived, on horseback, alone, soaked, angry. He said Dan was an idiot, that the Baron had been furious for 2 days. Then he calms down. Then he reread the letter. Then he looked at the toll reports from the Brynmore-Hollowstead road and ordered a carriage to be prepared. Baron Halford arrived 3 days later, in a carriage bearing the coat of arms, with 4 mounted guards, on the road Dan had built. From the castle to Hollowstead, they rode along old trails all day. From Hollowstead to Brynmore, it was an hour and a half on the new road. The Baron stepped out of the carriage in Brynmore Square, short, stocky, in his 50s, a red face, small, intelligent eyes, dressed richly but without taste, rings on thick fingers. He looked at the road he had come by, then at the square, then at Dan. Dan was standing by the well, in work clothes, with dirt under his fingernails, with a shovel against the wall behind him. The Baron approached, asked who he was. Dan replied that he was a road foreman. The Baron asked where he was from. Dan replied that he was from far away. The Baron asked who had taught him. Dan replied that life had. The Baron grunted. Then he asked him to show him the road. Not to drive through it, to show it. Explain how it's built. They walked the first kilometer, and Dan explained. 3 layers of gravel, cross slope, ditches, culverts, an embankment across a low-lying area, a serpentine on the ascent. The Baron listened in silence. Sometimes he leaned over and touched the stones. Sometimes he peered into a ditch. He stopped for a long time by the bridge. He put his hand on the railing. He stood there. Then he turned to Dan and said he wanted a road like this from his castle to Hollowstead. 25 kilometers. How much would it cost? Dan named a figure. The Baron grimaced. Dan said it could be cheaper if the Baron provided the labor, peasants for road work. The Baron thought it over. Peasants were needed in the fields, but the road was needed too. They reached a compromise. The Baron would provide 30 men after the harvest, from fall through spring, and he would pay for the tools. Dan would build the road over 2 winter seasons. Dan wanted to object that building in winter was more difficult. Then he thought better of it. In this climate, the winters are mild. The ground doesn't freeze very deep. Stone can be quarried in any weather, and the men are idle in the winter anyway. They drink, they fight, their wives complain. Better to have them haul rocks. He agreed. The Baron shook his hand. It was the first time an aristocrat had shaken hands with a dirty builder in work boots. Wallace stood behind the Baron and smiled quietly. He knew this would happen, because Wallace was just as good at counting money as Dan. And he saw that the tolls from a single road had brought the Baron more in 3 months than the taxes from Brynmore in a year. The Baron left, and Dan got a second contract. But the main event of the spring didn't involve the Baron. 2 weeks after the Baron's visit, a caravan from Stone Ridge arrived in Brynmore. 3 wagons, 10 people. Ricardo kept his word. He sent a man to Stone Ridge. The man found masons, and the masons arrived. A woman led the caravan, short, broad-shouldered, muscular arms with stone dust ingrained in the skin and traces of lime burns. Dark hair tied in a bun, a tanned and weather-beaten face. She approached Dan and introduced herself. Hannah Sun, mason, bridge builder, heir to the Sun family of Stone Ridge, 4th generation. Dan looked at her. She looked at him. Then she said she'd driven 200 kilometers on roads where 2 axles had broken and 1 horse had drowned. That she'd come because she'd heard that some madman was building roads that don't sink, and that she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Dan led her to Elvin's bridge. Hannah walked slowly across the bridge. She touched the stones. She bent down and looked at the masonry. She tapped the keystone with her fist. Then she stood up straight and said that the arch was good, but the mortar was weak, that the masonry was honest, but rough, that the bridge would last 20 years, maybe 30, but it could have lasted 200 if the stones had been cut properly and the mortar mixed with volcanic ash instead of river sand. Dan listened and smiled, because she was right, on every point. He knew it. Bran knew it. But they had neither volcanic ash nor the tools for precise hewing. They built with what they had. Hana nodded. She said she'd brought the tools, and that she knew where to get the ash. 100 kilometers to the east there is an extinct volcano. The locals dig up the ash to fertilize their fields, but its real use is mortar, Roman concrete. Dan froze. She said Roman concrete. No, she said imperial mortar. But she described exactly the same thing. Volcanic ash, lime, water. A mixture that hardens under water, that grows stronger with the years, that holds up bridges and aqueducts for millennia. In his world, it was called pozzolanic cement. Here, it was called imperial mortar and was considered lost knowledge. Dan asked how she knew the recipe. Hana replied that her grandmother knew it, and her mother knew it, that the women of the Son clan had preserved this knowledge for 3 centuries. While the men were at war and losing bridges, the women memorized how to build them. Only, there was nowhere to build them, because no one was ordering bridges, because there were no roads. Dan held out his hand to her. Hana looked at his hand, then at him, and shook it, firmly. Her palm was rough as sandpaper. The next day, Dan gathered everyone together. Miru, Hana and her people, Tarek, Bran, who had completely broken down over the winter but refused to leave, Ricardo, who had arrived again with goods, and laid a map on the table. Not the one the system showed, his own, drawn in charcoal on a piece of leather. The Great Triangle, Lowhaven, Caldor, Stone Ridge, 3 sides, 3 routes, 360 kilometers. He explained the plan. The first side, Lowhaven and Caldor, 120 kilometers across the plain and foothills, 2 large bridges over rivers, 1 causeway across a swamp. The second side, Caldor and Stone Ridge, 100 kilometers across the hills, 3 switchbacks, 1 tunnel. Yes, a tunnel, through a pass that can't be crossed any other way. The third route, Stone Ridge and Lowhaven, 140 kilometers through the mountains and the forest, the most difficult section, bridges over gorges, switchbacks on the cliffs, sections carved out of the rock. Hana listened, her eyes burning. She traced her finger across the map and whispered the names of the places. Grey Wind's Gorge, Silence Pass, the 3 Kings Bridge, which no longer exists. She knew these places. Her ancestors had built there, 300 years ago, before the long winter. Ricardo calculated, out loud, the cost of stone, the cost of tools, the cost of food for the workers, the cost of security. The numbers grew. His face darkened. Then he stopped and said he couldn't pull this off alone, that other investors were needed. Dan nodded. He knew. 1 trading house wasn't enough. 3 were needed, at least. 1 for each side of the triangle. And political support was needed, because the road would pass through the lands of 5 baronies and 2 kingdoms. Every baron would want his share. Every king would want control. If they didn't reach an agreement in advance, construction would be halted at the very first section. Mira raised her hand, quietly, like in class. She said they needed someone to negotiate, someone who knows how to talk to barons and kings, someone who knows etiquette, someone who understands how power works, someone of noble birth. Dan looked at her. She looked at him. They both thought the same thing, But that person hadn't appeared yet. He would appear. Dan could feel it. The system confirmed it with a faint golden flicker in the corner of his eye, as if it were saying, "Wait." They started with the first leg, Lowhaven and Caldor, 120 kilometers. Dan took Mira, Hanu with 3 masons, Tarika, and the 10 best men from the Bryn Mawr brigades. 20 people. Not enough. Catastrophically insufficient for a project of this scale, but enough to get started. They left Bryn Mawr in Dan's 8th month in this world, with 3 carts of tools, with a month's supply of food, with a map in Dan's head, and a map drawn on the back of a page in Mira's notebook. The journey to Caldor took 9 days, along those very red trails that the system had marked as impassable. 1 cart broke down. The second got stuck in the river for half a day. The people were soaked, frozen, exhausted. But they made it. Caldor turned out to be big, a real city. Thousands of residents, stone walls, a market where grain and livestock were traded, a garrison of the Royal Guard, and hunger. Not complete, not dire, but palpable. Dan saw it in the faces, in the thin children, in the empty stalls where there should have been fish. The fish were on the coast, in Lockhaven, 300 kilometers by sea, or 120 by land, but you couldn't get it there by land. There are no roads. Dan went to the city council. 3 elders, 2 merchants, 1 representative of the crown. He said who he was. He said he wanted to build. He said that Caldor would receive fish from the coast in 2 days if the road were built. The elders listened. The merchants did the math. The representative of the crown remained silent. Then the eldest of the elders asked how many people Dan needed. Dan replied, 100. For a year and a half. With food, with housing along the route, with the right to extract stone from any quarry in the district. The elder shook his head. 100 people is a lot. The town is already starving. Every worker is a mouth to feed. Dan replied that every worker is a mouth that, in a year and a half, will be eating fish from Lockhaven, and that the first shipments of fish would arrive not in a year and a half, but in 6 months, because Dan wouldn't wait for the entire road to be finished. He would open sections as construction progressed. The first 40 kilometers from Caldor westward across the plain, the easiest section. 6 months. After that, the route from the coast to Caldor would be shortened by a third. The fish would arrive fresh. The elders deliberated for 2 days. Then they agreed. 50 men. Not 100. 50. With food, with stone, with the right to the quarries. Dan would have to find the other 50 himself. Dan agreed. 50 makes 70, counting his own men, and he knew where to find the rest. On the road from Bryn Mawr to Caldor, they passed through 12 villages. In each one there were men out of work. In each there were hungry families. Dan would offer them the same thing he'd offered Bryn Mawr: work, food, a way home. Construction of the first section of the Caldor-Lowhaven Road began in the 9th month. The first 40 kilometers west of Caldor ran across a plain, flat, open, with rich black soil that was ideal for farming and a nightmare for a road. After rain, the black soil turned into knee-deep slush. After a drought, it cracked and crumbled. No bearing capacity, no stability, nothing to build on. Dan knew the solution. He'd seen it 1,000 times on the flatlands of Oregon and British Columbia. Stripping the topsoil. Removing the top layer down to the compacted soil, replacing it with a sand-gravel cushion, crushed stone on top. But there were no bulldozers here, only shovels and hands, and the soft soil was up to 1 meter deep in places. Dig 1 meter wide, by 4 meters long for 40 kilometers. That's 160,000 cubic meters of earth. By hand. Dan did the math. Then he did it again. The numbers didn't change. The system confirmed it. He looked at the map and started looking for detours. There was no way around it. The plain stretched 50 kilometers in both directions. Any detour would add a week to the journey. Then he started thinking differently. Not like an American engineer with a bulldozer. Like a Roman engineer with slaves and time. The Romans built roads through swamps. The Appian Way through the Pontine Marshes. 60 kilometers. 2,000 years ago. Without machinery. Like an embankment. Not digging out the soil, but raising the road above it. Not fighting the earth, but rising above it. Fences of brushwood at the bottom. A layer of stone. A layer of earth. A layer of stone. Tamp it down. Repeat. Dan explained this to Hannah. Hannah nodded. She said her grandmother had told her about the imperial embankments in the southern marshes. 1.5 meters high, 6 meters wide. They stood for 300 years, until the long winter tore them apart along with everything else. They began to build. 70 people, divided into 3 crews. The first cuts brushwood and ties it into bundles. The second hauls stone from the nearest quarry 15 kilometers away. The third lays it out and tamps it down. Dan moved from daily supervision to a system. Each crew had a foreman. The foreman received a blueprint of the section for the day, with dimensions, with tolerances, with marks indicating where to place stakes. Mira taught the foreman how to read blueprints. 2 days of training, then a check, then work. It was a decision that changed everything. Before, Dan had to stand over every stone. Now he designed and the crews built. He checked every other day, corrected mistakes, moved on. Mira became his eyes and ears. She rode between the crews on a small, shaggy horse given to her by the headman of Craigmore. She checked, she took notes, she reported in the evening. Her notebook became 2 notebooks, one for drawings, the second for reports. Stone consumption by day, output by crew, problems, delays, reasons for delays. Dan looked at her notes and thought that in his world this was called project management. Here, it was called Mira. In the 3rd week of construction, a woman arrived at the camp. Alone, on foot, with a travel bag and a sack slung over her shoulder. Short, thin, in a simple travel dress, glasses on her nose, strange ones, round, with cloudy lenses in a wire frame. Glasses were a rarity in this world. Dan was seeing them for the first time in 9 months. The woman approached Dan and introduced herself. Evelyn Carr, a healer, from Lockhaven. Dan asked what she was doing there. Evelyn replied that she was on her way to Caldor, that there was famine and disease in Caldor, that she was bringing medicine, and that halfway there she saw a construction site and couldn't believe her eyes. She asked what they were building. Dan replied that they were building a road. Evelyn asked where it was going. Dan replied that it was to Lockhaven. Evelyn fell silent. Then she took off her glasses and wiped them. Then she put them back on. And she said that if it was true, then it was more important than any of the medicine she was carrying in her bag. Dan asked why. Evelyn answered. She spoke evenly and calmly, without emotion, like a doctor who had long been accustomed to bad news. There is famine in Caldor. It hasn't been the first year. There is grain in the fields around the city, but there isn't enough protein. There is no fish. There is little meat. The children are sick from monotonous food. Scurvy, rickets, weakened immune systems. Then any infection comes along and wipes out the weakened. Last winter, 40 children died. Not from the plague, not from war, because fish is rotting in the port of Lockhaven, and it's impossible to get it here. Evelyn said she'd been banging her head against this wall for 3 years. She went to the Guild of Medical Mages. She said that it's not the disease that needs to be treated, but the cause. That clean water and proper food would save more children than all the spells in the world. They called her a heretic. They said a healer treats the body, not builds roads. They said that if she continued, they would revoke her license. She continued. They took it away. Dan listened and felt a familiar cold rage. That very same one, like at the turn in Oregon, like with the girl in Bryn Mawr. Children are dying because the fish doesn't get there. The fish doesn't get there because there is no road. There's no road because no one built it. No one built it because everyone thought it was impossible. And it's impossible because no one tried. A circle. A stupid, senseless circle in which children die. He told Evelyn that the road would be ready in 6 months. The first section. 40 kilometers. Not all the way to Lockhaven, but a third of the way closer. The fish will make it. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would stay, that she would help. Not with building, with treating the builders. Because 70 men doing hard labor means blisters, strains, cuts, fever from dirty water. If they aren't treated, the construction will grind to a halt. Dan hadn't thought of that. In his world, every construction site had a first aid station. Here, the men worked until they dropped. Then they lay there until they got up, or didn't get up. Evelyn set up a field hospital in 2 days. Water. Clean water from a stream she'd checked herself. Herbal decoctions for inflammation. Bandages made of clean cloth. Rules. Every cut gets washed. Every wound gets bandaged. Anyone who's been coughing for more than 2 days comes to her. The guys laughed at first. Big deal, a cut. Big deal, a cough. A week later, one of the men who hadn't come in with a cut came down with an infection. His arm had swollen to twice its size. Fever. Delirium. Evelyn treated him for 3 days. She pulled him through. After that, everyone came in with their cuts. Dan and Evelyn talked in the evenings. She told him about Lowhaven, about the Healers Guild, about how magical medicine works. Magic in this world could heal a wound quickly. It could bring down a fever. It could stop bleeding. But it couldn't cure hunger. It couldn't purify water. It couldn't deliver medicine 100 kilometers away. Magic worked on the body, but the problem was distance. Dan asked her why she wore glasses. Evelyn smiled. She said that in this world, poor eyesight was treated with a spell, an expensive one, for a year. Then you had to repeat it. She couldn't afford it. The lenses were made by a glass blower in Lowhaven. Warped, cloudy, but they work. Dan looked at her glasses and thought that someday he'd make her a proper pair, with the right lenses, polished, clear, when he found a good glass blower. The first 40 kilometers from Caldor were finished in 5 months, not 6 as he'd promised, a month early, because by the middle of construction, 30 more people had arrived. From those 12 villages Dan had passed through on his way to Caldor. They'd heard about the construction. They wanted to work. They wanted to eat. Dan took them all. Construction picked up speed. 100 people. 3 crews became 5. The embankment grew as if alive. 1/2 kilometer a day on flat sections. 200 meters on difficult ones. Hannah built culverts. Mira calculated the consumption. Evelyn treated the workers. Tarek hewn stones for the bridge piers, and said nothing. When the last stone was laid on the surface of the 40th kilometer, Dan stood on the road and looked west. There, beyond the horizon, lay another 80 kilometers to Lowhaven. 80 kilometers that didn't yet exist. But the first 40 did. Here, beneath his feet. And 3 days later,
the first convoy from the coast arrived on them. 20 barrels of salted fish, 10 sacks of salt, 5 barrels of fish oil. The journey that used to take 2 weeks took 9 days. The fish arrived fresh. The children of Caldor would have food this winter. The remaining 80 kilometers to Lowhaven ran through different terrain. The plain ended. The foothills began. Hills, ravines, forest tracks, 2 rivers, one wide and shallow, the other narrow and deep. Dan stood on a hill and looked at the terrain ahead. The system unfolded the map. The optimal route wound between the hills. It bypassed the ravines. It descended to river fords, climbed up to the ridges. More challenging than a plain. Much more challenging. But more interesting. Dan caught himself smiling. The engineering part of his brain was happy. This was real work. Not just a straight embankment, a route. With curves, with turns, with bridges, with changes in terrain. Everything he'd been taught. Everything he loved. By this point, nearly a year had passed since his arrival in this world. 10 months. 3 projects under his belt. The Bryn Mawr Star, Baron Halford's Road, which was being built in parallel by the Baron's men under the supervision of Tarek, whom Dan had left in charge, and the first 40 kilometers of the highway. His team had grown. 120 people on the main construction site, 30 on the Baron's Road, 10 in Bryn Mawr maintaining the existing roads. Hanna oversaw all the masonry work. Mira managed the project documentation and supervised the crews. Evelyn was in charge of health and safety. Dan designed and solved problems that no one else could solve. But there was one problem he couldn't solve: money. Ricardo was financing the construction, but his resources were not. 120 people ate every day. Tools broke and needed replacing. Iron was expensive. Ropes, fabric for tents, oil for the torches, medicinal herbs, everything cost money. And the money was running out. Dan did the math in the evenings. He added up the numbers. He checked them. He added them up again. The numbers didn't add up. At the current rate of spending, they had 3 months left. Then the food would run out, and the people would leave, and the road would come to a halt. Unfinished at the 58th kilometer. Useless. He sat by the fire and thought. Mira sat nearby and watched him silently. She could see he was counting. She knew the numbers were bad. She didn't ask. She waited. Dan said he needed a treasurer, someone who knows how to count money, find money, negotiate money, because he doesn't know how. He knows how to build. Mira said she knew one person, or rather, she'd heard of him, or rather, of her. There's a woman in Hollowstead. She showed up 6 months ago. She works as a clerk for a notary. She's literate. They say she's of noble birth. They say she left her family. They say she can count so well that merchants weep. Dan sent Mira to Hollowstead. Mira returned 4 days later, not alone. A woman of about 22 came with her, slender, upright, with a sharp chin and an even sharper gaze. Her clothes were simple, but fit as if they'd been tailor-made, manners you can't hide behind road dust. She dismounted, looked at the construction site, at the people, at the road, at the mud, at Dan in work boots, a shovel in his hand, and she said that Mira had promised her a job, a real job, not copying other people's papers for pennies. Dan asked who she was. The woman replied, Ariel Sonnen, call me Ari, daughter of Baron Sonnen of southern Earthania, former daughter, because she ran away from home 2 years ago when her father decided to marry her off to Count Maddox. The Count was 60. He had 4 dead wives and a great deal of money. Ari decided she wouldn't be the 5th. She packed her things, took the family earrings, she sold them in the very first town, and left. For 2 years she lived off correspondence and bookkeeping.
because that was the only thing she knew how to do besides embroidery and dancing. Dan looked at her, then at Mira.
Mira shrugged. Dan pulled a bag of papers out of his bag. 3 months' worth of expenses. The contract with Ricardo, duty records, stone calculations. All in a heap. All in disarray. He placed the bag in front of Ari and said that if she could make sense of it overnight, he'd appoint her treasurer. Ari looked at the bag, then at Dan. Then she sat down, untied it, pulled out the first piece of paper. 10 minutes later, she was already sorting the papers into 3 piles: expenses, income, contracts. An hour later, she found an error in Ricardo's calculations. The merchant had been charging a toll on empty carts, the ones returning without cargo. That was wrong, and Ari explained why. The toll is for the road, not the cargo. An empty cart travels on the road too. It wears down the stone as well. It takes up space too. Dan listened and thought that this woman had found in 10 minutes what he had missed in 3 months. By morning, Ari had presented him with a full report. 4 pages. Revenue, expenses, balance sheet, 6-month forecast, and a list of 12 points. 12 ways to cut expenses or increase revenue. Some were obvious. Buy iron in bulk through Ricardo instead of from local blacksmiths. Some were unexpected. Sell gravel from the quarry to villages along the highway. They take stone for their own needs anyway. Let them buy it from the construction site instead of hauling it themselves. Some were brilliant. Offer Caldor's trading houses personalized stones. For a large donation, the merchant's name would be carved into a bridge pier. Forever. Dan read the list and felt the weight that had been pressing on him for 3 months lift. Not because the problem was solved, the problem is enormous, but because now he's not alone with it. He appointed Ari as treasurer. She nodded. No smile, no thanks. She just said she needed a desk. A real desk. And ink. And a place where it doesn't drip. Dan laughed. Ari didn't laugh. She wasn't joking. A week later, she had a desk. In a tent with a canopy. With an inkwell. With a quill. With a box for papers. And with a view of the construction site. Ari worked from dawn till dusk. She wrote letters to trading houses. She drafted contracts. She kept track of every nail and every crust of bread. She argued with suppliers. She traded so fiercely that men twice her age would leave red-faced and flustered. Dan watched her and thought that in his world this woman would be a corporate CFO. Here, for 2 years, she had been rewriting other people's IOAs. Because she was born a woman in a world where women are judged by whom they are married off to, with Ari, the construction site came to life. Money stopped leaking away. Revenue from tolls on existing roads went to finance new sections. Ricardo brought in 2 new investors, the Cross Trading House from Lockhaven, the Warren Trading House from Stone Ridge. Both wanted roads. Both were ready to pay. Ari drafted the contracts in 3 days. Dan signed them without reading them. Ari looked at him with such an expression that he never signed anything without reading it again. Construction continued, kilometer after kilometer, over hills, through ravines, through the forest. The first bridge across a wide river. Hannah oversaw the construction. 3 stone piers, 2 spans, 15 meters each. A wooden deck on stone piers, not arched. The river was too wide and too shallow for an arch. A beam bridge. Oak beams 1/2 meter thick. 8 of them per span. It took 3 weeks to haul them from Fenwood. The bridge took a month to build. Hannah stood waist deep in the water and directed the placement of the piers. Her voice was the only sound on the river. The men listened without asking questions. When the bridge was ready, Hannah was the first to cross it, alone, slowly. She placed her hand on the railing. She stood there for a moment.
Then she turned back and nodded to Dan. "The bridge stands." Dan nodded in response. Nothing more needed to be said. 65 kilometers from Caldor, Dan encountered his first serious hostility. The village of Grayesmore, 30 households. At the intersection of the old trail and the new highway, the headman of Grayesmore came out to meet Dan with 10 men, all of them with axes. Not for work. He said the road wouldn't go through their land, that the new road would kill the village. Dan didn't understand. He asked why. The village head explained. Grayesmore lives by serving travelers on the old trail. An inn, a blacksmith to repair wheels, a guide across the swamp to the west. If the road went south as Dan planned, travelers would stop coming to Grayesmore. The village would die. Dan listened. He hadn't thought of that. In his world, highway construction was killing small towns along the old road. Motels were closing, diner signs were going dark, gas stations were going bankrupt. He'd seen it. He knew it hurt. He looked at the map in his head, then at the mayor, and offered a solution. The road would go through Grayesmore, not south of it, through the village, with a branch leading to the square, with a spot for a road station, the first road station on the route. Grayesmore's inn would become the official station. The blacksmith would repair not the wheels of random carts, but the wheels of dozens of carts every week. The village wouldn't die. The village would flourish. The route would be extended by 1.5 miles. Dan did the math. 1.5 miles. 20 minutes for a cart. Nonsense. And the village lives on. The village elder listened. The men lowered their axes. Then the elder asked what the toll would be. Dan replied that the road would be free for the residents of Grayesmore. Forever. Because the road runs through their land. They don't pay for what they've given. The village head extended his hand. Dan shook it. The next day, 15 men from Grayesmore showed up at the construction site. By the end of Dan's first year in this world, 90 kilometers of the road from Caldor to Loch Haven were complete. 30 remained, the most difficult. The last 30 kilometers before the coast descended from the foothills to the sea through a dense forest and a gorge the locals called the Throat. A narrow passage between 2 rock walls, 200 meters long, 15 meters wide at its narrowest point. A river flowed across the bottom of the gorge. Not wide, about 8 meters, but fast-flowing. A mountain stream, with rocks on the bottom and rapids that a wagon couldn't cross. The old trail bypassed the Throat from the north, through the forest. A 20-kilometer detour through mud and roots. A 3-day journey. Dan stood at the edge of the gorge and looked down. The system displayed the terrain. The gorge walls were made of dense limestone, strong, stable. There was room for a road at the bottom, but the river was in the way. To build a road along the bottom of the gorge, you'd need to either build a bridge across the river or divert the river to the side. A bridge across a mountain river in a narrow gorge. Kana stood nearby. She was looking at the same cliffs. She said her great-grandfather had built a bridge in this gorge before the winter. The 3 Kings Bridge, arched, stone, a span of 20 meters. It stood for 200 years. Then it collapsed when the glacier came down from the mountains and swept away everything in its path. The remains of the bridge are still visible. Stone bowls on both banks. Debris from the arch in the riverbed. Hannah went down to the remains. She touched the stones. Dan followed her down. He saw the masonry. Even after 300 years, it was clear that the stones fit together perfectly. No gaps, no mortar, just stone to stone, so precisely that water didn't seep between them. Hannah stood in silence. Then she said that they don't know how to do that anymore. that her family had preserved the knowledge but not the skill, that such masonry requires years of practice, decades. Dan put his hand on her shoulder. He said they would build a new bridge, not like this one, a different one, with their own solutions, with their own mortar, with their own masonry. No worse, just different.
Hannah looked at him. Then she nodded.
They began designing. The bridge across the gorge became the first truly large structure on the route, a span of 25 meters. The arch rose 6 meters above the water level, so that even at high water the river wouldn't reach the deck. A stone arch resting on 2 piers carved into the rocky walls of the gorge. Imperial mortar mixed with volcanic ash that Hannah had brought from the base of an extinct volcano. It took 2 months to build. 60 people. Hannah supervised the stonework. Dan designed the formwork, the wooden frames that hold the arch in place until the mortar sets. Mira coordinated the delivery of stone from above via ropes. Ari calculated the material usage and argued with the suppliers of iron for the staples. Evelyn treated the bruises and cuts, of which there were more on this construction site than on any other. Work in the gorge, above the river, high up. Every stone was lifted by hand. Every block was hewn on site, because you can't lower finished blocks down the gorge walls. It was scary. Dan didn't show it, but every morning when the men descended to the scaffolding above the river, he stood at the top and counted heads. Every evening he counted again. Everyone had returned. Good. Tomorrow again. In the 6th week of the bridge's construction, people arrived at the camp whom no one was expecting. 5 horsemen, well-dressed, armed, not soldiers, not bandits, something in between. Their leader called himself Alec Thorne, a representative of the Guild of Old Caravanners. Dan had heard of them. Mira had told him. Ari had told him more. The Caravanners Guild controlled the trade routes on the continent. It didn't build, didn't repair them, controlled them. Their people knew the routes, knew where the safe fords were, where you could pass in winter, where the bandits lurked. That knowledge cost money. Merchants paid the guild for guides, for protection, for information. The monopoly on route knowledge had sustained the guild for 3 centuries, since the fall of the empire. Dan built roads anyone could travel, without a guide, without guards, without knowing the route. Dan was destroying their business. Alec Thorne was polite. He smiled. He spoke calmly. He offered Dan tea from his own supply. Good tea. Dan accepted. They sat by the fire and Alec spoke. He said that the guild wasn't against the roads, that the guild was for progress, that the guild wanted to cooperate, that the guild was offering Dan a contract. The guild would take over security for his roads, provide guides for the duration of construction, help with logistics. In exchange, Dan would transfer to the guild the right to manage tolls on all his roads, forever. Dan listened. He drank tea. Then he set down his cup and said, "No." Alec didn't stop smiling. He asked why. Dan explained. The tolls go toward road maintenance. If he gives them to the guild, there will be no maintenance. A road without maintenance falls apart in 5 years. In 5 years, it will be the same as it is now. Only the guild will be richer. Alec said maintenance could be discussed, that the guild would allocate a percentage for repairs. Dan asked how much. Alec said 10. Dan shook his head. Even in his world, road maintenance took up 30% of the budget. In this world, where stone is crushed by hand and hauled by oxen, 30 is the bare minimum. 10% is nothing. Alex stopped smiling. He said that Dan was making a mistake, that the guild could be a friend. Or it might not be. That roads are good. But roads can be destroyed. Stone breaks, bridges burn, people get sick. Dan looked at him. Then he said that was a threat. Alex said it was an observation. He stood up. He thanked them for the tea and left. Dan sat by the fire. Mira sat next to him. Hannah stood behind him. Ari sat with a notebook, writing down everything she could remember from the conversation. Evelyn was silent. Dan said they needed security now. Real security. Not guys with axes. Professionals. Ari nodded. She said she knew where to look, that there were mercenary units in Ertania, former soldiers, who could be hired for a reasonable price if you knew who to turn to. Dan asked how she knew. Ari smiled. She said she'd grown up in a baron's castle, that her father hired mercenaries more often than he bought wine, and that she remembers the names. 3 weeks later, a squad arrived at the camp. 12 men, led by a woman, tall, straight back, a scar on her cheekbone running from her left ear to her chin, calm eyes, a sword at her belt, a short bow on her back, chainmail under her traveling cloak. She introduced herself. Songhua Yun, a former officer of the Ertanian Royal Guard, a mercenary, commander of the Silver Shield Squad. Ari stood and bowed. She knew that name. Songhua Yun was a legend in Ertania, the best tactician in the Royal Guard in 20 years. She left 3 years ago. Rumors said she refused to carry out an order. No one knew what order. But they knew that after that, she had been struck from the rolls and declared a deserter. Songhua approached Dan. She looked at the construction site, at the people, at the bridge, at the gorge. Then she looked at Dan and asked one thing. What was the mission? Dan replied, guarding the construction site, guarding the roads, protecting the people. Songhua asked from whom? Dan said, from those who don't want the roads built. Songhua nodded. She said she understood, and that her people were ready. A 1-year contract, monthly pay, plus food and lodging. Ari was already doing the math. Dan was already nodding. The bridge across the gorge was completed a week after Songhua's arrival. The scaffolding was removed. The arch stood, 25 meters of stone over the mountain river. Hannah stood on the bridge and cried. Silently, without a sound. Tears simply streamed down her tanned cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Dan stood beside her and said nothing. He understood. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a homecoming. The Sun Clan is building bridges again, after 300 years. They covered the last 20 kilometers to Lowhaven in 2 months. The road descended from the foothills to the coast through the forest. Songhua led the reconnaissance ahead. Her men patrolled the flanks. Twice they found tracks. Someone was watching the construction. Someone was counting the people. Someone was drawing a map of the camp. Songhua reported to Dan. Dan nodded. The Caravanners Guild was watching. For now, just watching. But Dan knew that surveillance was the first step. The second would be worse. The road between Caldor and Lowhaven was completed in the 14th month. 120 kilometers, 4 bridges, 6 embankments, 12 culverts, 2 switchbacks, 3 road stations, including Graysmore. 200 people had been building it for over a year. No one had died. 4 were maimed. They all survived thanks to Evelyn. When the first caravan from Lowhaven entered Caldor via the new road, Dan stood at the city gates. The caravan had been traveling for 2 days, not 2 weeks, 2 days. 20 wagons. Fish, salt, cloth, spices, wine. The city council came out to greet them. Elders, merchants, guards, and people. Hundreds of people, who stood along the road and watched the wagons, in silence, because they didn't believe they'd live to see this day. Ari stood next to Dan. She was taking notes. Then she leaned toward him and whispered that fish prices in Caldor would drop by half by next month. Dan said that was good. Ari said it wasn't just good. It meant children would stop dying of hunger. She said it in an even voice, without emotion. Then she turned away and quickly wiped her eyes. Dan pretended not to notice. After the road was finished, Dan gave the men 2 weeks off, their first real break in a year and a half. The men went home. Hannah left for Stone Ridge to bring back more people and tools. Mira stayed in Caldor and took care of the stations. 3 road stations along the route needed to be set up. Wells, sheds, a supply of firewood, horse feeders. Mira was handling it. She hadn't been an apprentice for a long time. She was an engineer, a young one, inexperienced by Dan's standards. But here she was the best road engineer after Dan himself, and the only one who could read his blueprints without explanation. Dan spent those 2 weeks in Lowhaven. It was the first time he'd seen the sea in this world. Gray, cold, with a salty wind that stung his face so hard that tears streamed down of their own accord. The port was large, 20 docks, ships, warehouses, the smell of fish and tar, and people. Lots of people. More than Dan had seen in all his time in this world. Lowhaven was a wealthy city, by local standards. Stone houses, paved streets. Not all of them, but the central ones. Guards in uniform, trading posts with signs. Even a single fountain in the main square. Not working, but a fountain. Dan walked through the city and looked around, and he saw what the locals didn't see. The streets were cobblestone, but haphazardly laid. Stones of varying sizes, gaps wide enough for a hand. Rainwater pooled because there was no slope. Sewers, open ditches running along the houses, stagnant water. The smell, flies, disease. The port. The piers are wooden. They're rotting. The road from the port to the warehouses is 200 meters of mud. Carts loaded with fish get stuck right at the water's edge. The fish spoils while it's being unloaded. Dan sat on the waterfront and counted the losses. How much fish rots because of the bad road from the pier to the warehouse? How much merchandise spoils because of the puddles in the streets? How many people get sick because of the standing water? The numbers were staggering. The city was losing 1/4 of its revenue on something that could be fixed in 6 months. He went to the Lockhaven City Council. A different council, different people, but the same problem. Dan made his proposal. The council listened. The council had its doubts. One of the councilmen, a fat man with a red face and rings, he asked Dan straight out, what was in it for him? Why would an outsider builder want to fix up their city? What would he get out of it? Dan answered honestly. Road tolls, a percentage of the increase in trade volume, and the right to continue building. The fat councilman snorted. He said Dan was cunning, that he'd come to take their money. Dan said he wasn't taking it, but creating it. That a toll on a road that doesn't exist is 0. A toll on a road that does exist is money for everyone. The council voted. 4 in favor, 2 against. 1 abstained. Dan received the contract to reconstruct the Port Road and 3 central streets of Lockhaven, with drainage, with storm sewers, with a proper paved surface, payment from the city treasury, partially, the rest from the tolls that would come in after completion. Ari arrived 2 days later, with papers, with an inkwell,
with an expression that meant she had already found 3 errors in the contract and was going to correct them. She sat down with the city scribe and rewrote the contract for 4 hours. The scribe came out looking pale. Ari came out with a notebook full of numbers, satisfied. In Lockhaven, Dan encountered real magic for the first time. Not the golden letters of the system, the magic of this world. On the second day of work, a man in a long gray robe, an elderly man, gray-haired, with a staff, a road mage. Yes, they existed. It turned out that in the Empire there were mages who specialized in roads, spells to strengthen the ground, charms against erosion, roadstones that glowed at night and showed the way, magical markings on bridges that warned of overloading. All of this had been lost along with the Empire, but not entirely. This mage, his name was Olven. He was the last apprentice of the last Imperial Road Mage. He was 78. He had preserved this knowledge his entire life. There was nowhere to apply it, because there were no roads. Olven stood before Dan and spoke softly. He said he had been watching his construction, that he had seen the road, that the road was good, but that it could be better, with magic. Dan asked what exactly magic could do. Olven demonstrated. He placed his hand on a paving stone. He whispered a few words. The stone glowed with a warm yellow light. Then the light faded. Dan picked up the stone. It was heavier, denser. The crack that had been on the surface was gone. Olven said this was basic reinforcement, that it would last 3 years, that the road needed something else. Milestones, placed every kilometer, that glow at night, that show the distance to the next station, that warn of danger. But there's a condition. Milestones only work on roads traveled by people, living people with good intentions. The more people who have passed by, the brighter the stone. The more gratitude in their hearts, the stronger the protection. Magic isn't created out of nothing. It grows from gratitude. Dan listened and felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The system gave him engineering knowledge. Magic provided additional protection. But both worked only through people, through real, living people who walk the roads and are grateful for them. You can't build a road in the desert and expect miracles. You have to build a road for people, so that people would walk, so that they would be grateful, so that the magic would work. He asked Alvin if he would stay. Alvin smiled. He said he had been waiting for that question for 78 years. Ever since his teacher died and told him, "Wait. The one who builds will come. When he comes, go to him." Alvin stayed. The first milestone stones appeared on the road between Caldor and Lockhaven a month later. Small granite posts every kilometer. By day, ordinary stones with carved numbers. Distance to Caldor. Distance to Lockhaven. At night, they glowed with a warm yellow light, dim for now because few people had traveled the road yet, but brighter with each passing day. Dan stood on the road at night and watched the lights receding into the distance. 120 yellow dots from Caldor to the sea. His road, alive, glowing. Songhua stood nearby, silently. She was always silent unless asked. Dan asked what she was thinking. Songhua replied that the road was beautiful. Then she paused, and added that beautiful things attract those who want to take them away. Dan nodded. He knew. The Caravanners' Guild, the barons through whose lands the next roads would pass, the kings who would want control, the church. He had been told about the Church of the Long Winter, a religion that considered the cataclysm a divine punishment, that taught that restoring the imperial roads was a sin, that the world's fragmentation was a punishment for pride, and that whoever mends what is broken goes against the will of the gods. So far, the church hadn't paid any attention to Dan. 120 kilometers of road is a trifle for an organization that controls half the temples on the continent. But when Dan starts on the second side of the triangle, when the rumors reach the archbishop, things will be different. Dan turned to Songhua. He said he needed more people, not builders, security. Songhua nodded. She said she would write to some old acquaintances, that there were people who had left the army and were looking for service under a worthy commander. Dan asked what worthy meant. Songhua looked at the road, at the lights, and said that worthy meant someone whose cause was worth dying for. Dan wanted to say he didn't want anyone to die for his roads, but he kept quiet, because he knew it wasn't his choice. The choice would be made by those who wanted to stop him. 3 days after that conversation, the station master was found dead at the road station in Grayesmore, slaughtered, at night, quietly. A symbol was drawn on the wall in charcoal, a wheel crossed out with a cross, the symbol of the Caravanners Guild. The message was simple: roads can be destroyed, people can be killed. We warned you. Dan stood in the dead caretaker's room and looked at the mark on the wall. Songhua stood beside him. Her face was stony. She said 3 words. This is a declaration of war. Dan nodded. War is war. He wasn't going to stop, because to stop would be to say that murder works, that if you kill one person, the road will disappear, that fear is stronger than stone. Dan knew that wasn't true. Stone lasts 1,000 years. Fear fades in a generation. He sent Ari to Baron Halford with a letter. He sent Ricardo to the trading houses. He sent Mira to the village elders. The same message to all. The Caravanners Guild had killed the overseer. This was not a threat to Dan. It was a threat to everyone who used the road, to every merchant, to every peasant, to every child being taken to the doctor. The reply came faster than Dan expected. The Baron sent 10 soldiers. The trading houses chipped in for a second dozen mercenaries. The village elders sent 2 men each with axes, not a guard, but a presence. People stood on the road and showed that it wasn't empty, that there were people to stand up for it. Songhua organized patrols. She divided the road into sections, 2 people in each section during the day and 2 at night. The stations were fortified. The doors were replaced. Bolts were installed. The guards were given horns for the alarm. Dan looked at all this and thought that he was no longer just building a road. He was building an institution, an organization, with its own rules, its own security, its own administration, with its own law on its own territory. The system flashed. Level 6. Available. Road law. Toll system. Road patrols. Dan read the description and nodded quietly. The system knew. It had always known. A road isn't stone. A road is people. And to protect the stone, you have to organize the people. Dan began building the second side of the Great Triangle in the 16th month. The route from Caldor to Stone Ridge, 100 kilometers through the hills and foothills, 3 switchbacks, and a tunnel. That very tunnel through the pass that Dan had marked on the very first map. The Pass of Silence.
It was named that because the wind at an altitude of 2,000 meters howled so fiercely that it drowned out voices. People who crossed the pass in winter couldn't hear one another, and they couldn't hear the avalanches. Every winter, the pass claimed 3 or 4 caravans, sometimes more. There was no detour, or rather, there was one, 200 kilometers to the south, through the lands of 3 baronies that were at war with each other and charged such high tolls that it was cheaper to risk the pass. Dan stood at the foot of the pass and looked up. The system displayed the geology. The rock was soft, limestone with layers of shale, not ideal for a tunnel, but not hopeless either. According to the system's calculations, the tunnel would be 300 meters long. If they cut through the mountain at its narrowest point at an altitude of 1,400 meters, 600 meters below the pass, below the avalanche zone, below the zone of constant wind, 300 meters of tunnel instead of 12 kilometers of ascent over the open pass. Hannah looked at the mountain, then at Dan. She said her great-grandfather had dug a 70-meter tunnel for the Imperial Road in the south. It took him 2 years and 300 men. 300 meters is 4 times that. Dan nodded. He knew. In his world, a 300-meter tunnel was drilled with a tunnel boring machine in a few months. Here, he had pickaxes and gunpowder. Gunpowder. Yes. He'd learned about gunpowder in his 2nd month. Primitive. Weak. Used mainly for fireworks and rarely for mining. But it was there. And Dan knew a thing or two about blasting. Not much. Enough not to kill people. He spent a month preparing. Test pits, rock assessment, marking the portal, calculating the cross-section. 3 meters wide, 2.5 meters high. Enough for a cart. An arched vault for distribute the load. Wooden supports for now, then stone facing with imperial mortar. Ulvin, an old mage, had come from Lochhaven. He said there were magical lamps in the imperial tunnels, stones embedded in the walls that glowed constantly, powered by the movement of people inside. The more people passed through, the brighter the light. He could install such ones. If the tunnel is ready, work has begun. 150 people. Of them, 30 masons brought by Hannah from Stone Ridge, 20 experienced miners found by Ricardo. The rest were unskilled laborers. Songhua posted guards along the entire perimeter. After the murder in Grayesmore, there had been no attacks, but surveillance continued. Her people caught guild scouts once a week. They caught them and let them go. Songhua said it was foolish to kill the scouts. Let them watch. Let them see that construction is continuing. Let them report back to their people. Fear works both ways. They were tunneling from both sides simultaneously, the southern crew and the northern crew, 1.5 meters a day, sometimes 1 meter, sometimes 2. They used the gunpowder carefully, small charges, precisely calculated. Dan stood at the face every time they set a charge. He checked it personally, because a mistake with explosives in a confined space isn't a crack in the road, it's death. In the 6th week, the northern crew struck an aquifer. Water gushed into the face. Not heavily, but enough to flood the tunnel up to the knees in an hour. Work came to a halt. Dan went down into the face. He looked at the water. He tasted it. Fresh, clean, an underground stream. The system showed the direction of the flow. The water was flowing from west to east. If they drove a drainage tunnel down and to the east, the water would drain away on its own. 10 meters of additional tunneling, 2 days of work. He explained to the miners what to do. They looked at him with a respect Dan wasn't yet used to seeing. To them, he was a man who could see through rock. The water drained away. Work continued. In the 10th week, the crews met, the southern and northern ones. The accuracy of the junction was 14 centimeters horizontally and 8 vertically. In a world without laser theodolites or GPS, only the system and experience.
Dan stood at the junction point and looked at the light on both sides. 2 round openings in the darkness of the mountain, and between them 300 meters of stone that was now a road. The men shouted. They hugged each other. Someone cried. Kana stood by the wall and touched the stone. Her people were facing the vault, stone by stone, with imperial mortar. In 200 years, it would be stronger than the mountain itself. Alvin entered the tunnel when the facing was finished. He walked slowly from one portal to the other, touching the walls, whispering. Dan followed him and saw warm yellow dots lighting up in the stone, one after another. Every 10 meters, 30 lamps. Dim for now, but they were burning. For the first time in 300 years, a light burned inside the mountain. Alvin reached the southern portal. He stopped, turned to Dan, and said that his teacher would be pleased. Dan replied that he was pleased himself. Alvin smiled and said that it was all the same. In parallel with the tunnel, the rest of the road was being built. Serpentine roads over 3 mountain passes, bridges across mountain streams, embankments across marshy valleys. Mira supervised the western section. On her own, without Dan. 30 kilometers from Caldor to the foothills. She was managing. Dan checked in every 2 weeks. He found minor errors. He corrected them, but less and less often. Mira learned faster than he taught. By the end of the 20th month, the Caldor Stone Ridge Road was ready. 100 kilometers, 1 tunnel, 3 switchbacks, 7 bridges, 4 road stations, and 0 fatalities. That had become the rule. Dan's rule. No one dies on his construction sites. Stone Ridge greeted them with stone. In a good way. The city of stonemasons held a ceremony. The stone gates at the city entrance were decorated with garlands. The master stonemasons of the guild came out to greet them. The senior master, a gray-haired old man with hands the size of shovels. He approached Hana. He bowed, and said that the Sun family had restored honor to Stone Ridge. Hana stood straight. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood there, and her hands were trembling. Dan saw it. He was the only one who saw it. Ricardo brought the first caravan of ore from Stone Ridge to Caldor 2 days after the road opened. Ore that used to take 3 weeks to transport arrived in 4 days. Caldor's blacksmiths got iron cheaper than ever. Tool prices dropped. Peasants could buy shovels and axes. More tools, more cleared land, more harvest, more food. A chain, a road, ore, iron, tools, land, food, life. Dan stood in Stone Ridge Square and looked at the wagons loaded with ore, and he thought that only one leg remained, the hardest one. Stone Ridge and Lowhaven, 140 kilometers through the mountains, through the Grey Winds Gorge, through the lands of 2 kingdoms that don't speak to each other, through the territory where the Caravanners Guild is at its strongest. He finished his tea, set down the mug, and began to calculate. The third side of the Great Triangle began with politics. The route from Stone Ridge to Lowhaven passed through the lands of the Kingdom of Earthania and the Barony of Norgard. Earthania was large, rich, with an army and ambitions. Norgard was small, poor, with pride and a long memory. They had been at war for 80 years, a mountain pass on the border. The pass had no strategic significance, but a temple once stood there that both sides considered their own. The temple had long since collapsed. The pass was overgrown. No one walked across it anymore. But the feud remained. Dan needed permission from both sides. The road ran 30 kilometers through Urtania and 20 through Norgard. Without the consent of either side, construction was impossible. Ari said she knew people at the Urtanian court, that her father, Baron Sonnen, though he had stripped her of her inheritance, had not erased her from the aristocracy's memory, that the name Sonnen still opened doors. Some doors. She went to the capital of Ertan, alone. Songhua wanted to provide her with a guard. Ari refused. She said that a noblewoman with mercenaries was a threat. A noblewoman alone was a request. Doors open to requests, not threats. She left. Dan waited 2 weeks. He worked on the section east of Stone Ridge, a mountain road, switchbacks, a rock cut. Hana was blasting rock and building retaining walls. The men were gnawing into the mountains with pickaxes and crowbars. The hardest work ever. Every meter cost 3 times as much as on the plain. Ari returned on the 15th day. Not alone. A man had come with her. Young, in fine clothes, with a signet ring on his finger. The secretary to the king of Urthania. He had brought a letter. The king was interested. Very interested. So interested that he offered Dan a title, Count of the Roads, a castle on the coast, and the hand of a princess, the 3rd daughter, 20 years old. Dan read the letter. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Ari. Ari was looking away. Her face was stony. Dan asked what had happened at court. Ari replied in an even voice. She had met with the chancellor, explained the project. The chancellor took an interest, brought him to the king. The king listened for an hour. Then he proposed a deal. A title, a castle, the princess. In exchange, Dan would enter the king's service. All roads would be built in the name of Urthania. All tolls would go to the treasury. The Guild of Roads, which Dan hadn't founded yet but was already planning, would become a royal agency. Dan understood. The king didn't want roads. The king wanted Dan, as a tool, as a weapon. Roads gave the army mobility. Whoever controls the roads controls the war. And Urtania was preparing for war, against the Northern Alliance. The 3 kingdoms in the north that had united against the southern hegemon. Dan sat by the fire and thought. Accepting the offer meant gaining resources, an army of builders, endless funding. The road would be ready in 6 months. But the road would belong to the king, and the king would decide who travels on it, and when, and why. And the first to travel on it would be soldiers, not merchants, not peasants with apples, not grandmothers visiting their sisters. Soldiers. To war. Dan refused. He wrote the reply himself. He thanked the king for the honor. He explained that roads must be neutral, that everyone must be able to travel on them, that a road belonging to a single kingdom is not a road but a military facility, and that he is an engineer, not a general. The secretary left with the letter. Ari stood nearby. She was silent. Then she said that Dan had done the right thing, and that now the king would become an enemy. Dan nodded. He knew. A week later, a reply arrived. Not a letter, an order. Royal guards blocked a section of the highway on Urthania's territory. 20 kilometers of road from Grey'smoor to the barony's border. The guards took up positions at the road stations. They let no one through. Merchants turned back. Peasants stayed home. The road came to a standstill. Dan stood at the edge of the blockade and looked at the guards. They didn't want to be there. He could see it in their faces. They were standing on a road that was better than any road they had ever seen in their lives. And they were blocking it on the orders of a man who had never walked on it. Dan didn't fight. He didn't threaten. He didn't try to go around them. He went to Baron Norgard, a small barony on the other side of the mountains, poor, proud, hostile to Urtania. Dan offered Baron Norgard the same thing he offered everyone: a road through his lands, in exchange for his consent, with tolls, with a road station, with a bridge across the gorge on the border. Baron Norgard was old, cunning, poor. He asked why he needed a road that Urtanian soldiers would use. Dan replied that merchants would come along the road, with food, with cloth, with iron, which Norgard hadn't seen in years, because all trade routes went through Urtania, and Urtania wouldn't let them into Norgard. But the new route would go through the mountains, past Urtania, straight to the coast. The Baron thought about it for 3 days. Then he agreed. Dan changed the route. Instead of 30 kilometers through Urtania, the road went 40 kilometers through Norgard. 10 kilometers longer, more difficult, more expensive, but bypassing Urtania. The king of Urtania found out a week later. 2 weeks later, the blockade was lifted. The guards left, because the blockade only made sense if the route went through Urtania. If the route goes through Norgard, the blockade is pointless. Moreover, the blockade was becoming a punishment for Urtania itself. The merchants who were barred from the road found a detour through Norgard, and they never returned. Because the route through Norgard was shorter, Ari calculated Urtania's losses from the blockade. 13 days of a closed road cost the treasury more than maintaining a garrison for 3 months. She wrote these figures down on paper and asked Ricardo to pass them on to the right people at court. A month later, another envoy arrived from Urtania. Not a secretary, the chancellor himself. The conversation was different. No titles, no princesses. Businesslike. The chancellor asked under what conditions Dan would agree to route a section of the highway through Urtania. Dan stated the conditions. The same as for everyone else. A neutral road. Tolls go toward maintenance. The Guild of Roads manages the highway. The king receives a share as a landowner, not as the road's owner. The chancellor haggled for 2 days. Ari sat across from him and didn't give an inch. The chancellor left with a contract that Ari had drafted, so that Urtania's lawyers spent a month poring over it afterward and found not a single loophole. Construction continued, on both routes, through Urtania and through Norgard. 2 roads to a single destination. Dan built both, because the road through Norgard isn't just a detour, it's an alternative. If one closes, the other remains open. The network must have redundancy. That's a basic principle of engineering, and a basic principle of survival. The Grey Winds Gorge, a 200-meter span, 300 meters deep. A wind that knocks you off your feet. Cliffs that drop vertically down to the river at the bottom. And no bridge. Dan stood at the edge of the gorge for 23 months and realized that this was the most difficult engineering challenge he had ever faced, in both worlds. In Oregon, he had built bridges across canyons, but with concrete, with steel, with cranes and drilling rigs. Here, he had stone, mortar, ropes, his hands, and Hana. Hana stood beside him. She looked down. The wind ruffled her hair. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that an arch bridge was impossible. The span was too wide. A 200-meter stone arch wouldn't support its own weight, not even with imperial mortar. Dan nodded. He knew. He'd been thinking about it for a month, and he'd found a solution. Not an arch, a suspension bridge. Stone pylons on both banks, ropes between them, a deck on the ropes. In his world, suspension bridges had been built for 1,000 years. from simple rope crossings to the Golden Gate in San Francisco. The principle was the same: 2 anchors, 2 supports, a cable between them. The deck hangs on suspension cables. There were no steel cables here, but there were chains. Iron chains forged in Stone Ridge, and ropes. Thick, braided ropes made of plant fibers. Dan spent 3 weeks designing it. The system calculated the loads. He checked them by hand. Hana checked his work. The bridge consisted of 2 stone pylons 15 meters high, 4 supporting chains, each made of 300 links of wrought iron, a wooden deck 3 meters wide, and rope hangers every 2 meters. Design load: 2 loaded carts at the same time. Sounds modest, but for this world, it was a miracle. Building the bridge across the gray winds took 4 months. The first month was spent on the pylons, stone towers at both ends of the gorge. Hana built them like fortresses, walls 2 meters thick, foundations cut 3 meters into the rock, imperial mortar, the finest quality stone from Stone Ridge. The second month on the chains. The blacksmiths of Stone Ridge forged them non-stop, 600 links for each chain. Kana inspected every link personally. She tapped it with a hammer. She listened to the sound. If the sound was off, the link went back to the forge. The blacksmiths cursed. Hana paid no attention. The third month was spent hauling the chains across the gorge. That was the most dangerous part. Dan devised a system. First, a thin rope, tied to an arrow. The arrow flew across the gorge. The rope was secured on the other side. They pulled the cable across the rope. Then, the first chain along the cable, link by link, 200 meters of iron hanging over the abyss. The men pulled it by hand. Songhua stood at the edge and gave orders. Her voice was the only one that drowned out the wind. She wasn't shouting. She was speaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. When the first chain was laid on the pylons and secured, Dan realized it was possible. The remaining 3 chains were installed within a week, because the first one was the hardest. The rest followed it like a guide. The 4th month was spent on the decking and suspension cables. Carpenters cut the planks. Rope workers wove the suspension cables. Workers attached them to the chains. Over the abyss, in the wind. Every worker was tied with a rope to the chain. Dan's rule: no one goes out onto the bridge without a safety line. The men got used to it. They stopped being afraid. They started joking over the abyss. Dan didn't joke. He counted the men every morning and every evening. Everyone's alive. Good. Tomorrow again. The bridge was ready by the 27th month. Dan stood on one bank and looked at the structure. 200 meters. 4 chains glistened in the sun. The wooden deck swayed in the wind. Rope railings, the pylons stood like fortress towers. Hana stood on the other bank. She was the first to cross the bridge. Alone, as always. Slowly. She placed her hand on a chain. She stood in the middle. The wind blew in her face. She didn't move. Then she reached the end. She turned around, and for the first time in all the time Dan had known her, she smiled. Widely, openly, like a child. Dan saw that smile from 200 meters away and remembered it forever. Alvin had installed guide stones on the pylons. They glowed brightly, brighter than any others along the route, because by this point, thousands of people were walking Dan's roads every day, and every one of them was grateful. The bridge over the gray winds became a symbol, not because Dan wanted it to, because the people decided so. Bards sang of it in taverns, merchants told of it in ports. A month after it opened, people came to the bridge just to look at it, from the 3 kingdoms.
It annoyed Dan. He said the bridge was an engineering structure, not a tourist attraction. Ari said a tourist attraction brings in revenue. Ari always won those arguments. The remaining sections of the road from Stone Ridge to Loch Haven were completed alongside the bridge. Winding roads, cuts in the rocks, small bridges over streams, road stations in mountain villages. By the 28th month, the third side of the triangle was complete. The Great Triangle was closed. 360 kilometers of roads, 3 cities connected. Loch Haven, Caldor, Stone Ridge. Fish from the coast to the mountains in 3 days, or from the mountains to the coast in 4. Grain from the plains to the port in 2. Prices fell. Trade flourished. The famine in Caldor ended. Forever. Dan stood on a hill from which he could see the road stretching south toward the coast and east toward the mountains. 2 lines. His lines. And he thought it was time. Time to stop being a builder. Time to become something greater. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Roads without an owner are vulnerable. Roads without law are just stones. Dan founded the Guild of Roads in the 30th month of his life in Velgard. Not in a grand hall, not with fanfare, in a tent at the intersection of 3 roads, at a table made of planks, with Mira on his right and Ari on his left, with Hana by the wall, with Songhua at the entrance, with Evelyn in the corner, with Olvin on a stool, with Inji. Inji had appeared a month ago, quietly, unnoticed, like everything she did. Small, 20 years old, ink-stained fingers, huge eyes. The daughter of an imperial archivist from a city Dan had never heard of before. She came with a roll of maps under her arm. Ancient, yellowed, imperial. And she said that Dan was building blindly, that she had eyes. The maps were priceless. Dan unfolded the first one, and his breath caught in his throat. A complete network of imperial roads, all the highways, all the bridges, all the stations, all the tunnels, the entire infrastructure of the Cetrian Empire before the long winter. Thousands of kilometers, hundreds of bridges, dozens of tunnels, a system that connected every city, every village, every fortress on the continent. And all of it vanished in a single winter. Inji said she had kept these maps her whole life, that her father had kept them before her, and his father before him. 3 centuries, waiting for someone who could use them. Dan asked why she thought it was him. Inji looked at him with her huge eyes and said she had seen his roads on the map, that she had superimposed his routes onto the imperial network, and that they matched. Not exactly, but the directions are the same, the nodes are the same, the logic is the same. He's building the same network, without knowing about it. And that means he sees what the imperial road builders saw, or something is guiding him along the same paths. Dan said nothing, because he knew it was the system that remembers the old roads, that knows where they were, and is leading him in their footsteps. Yinji became the chief cartographer, and then something greater. Her agents, former scribes, former clerks, quiet, unobtrusive people who knew how to read and listen. They appeared in every major city along the route. They gathered information about prices, about the mood, about troop movements, about the plans of barons and merchants. Inji knew everything, and quietly told Dan over dinner. The Guild of the Roads was formalized on Ari paper, a charter, 23 articles, rights and responsibilities, management structure, a system of fees, rules for construction and maintenance, quality standards, dispute resolution procedures. Dan wrote the technical section, Ari wrote the legal section, Mira wrote the engineering section, Hana wrote the construction section, Songhua wrote the section on security, Evelyn wrote the section on medical care. Yinjie wrote the section on cartography and reconnaissance. 7 women, 7 sections, 1 charter. Dan looked at the finished document and thought it was a constitution. A small constitution for a small state that has no territory but owns the roads. And that roads are more than territory. Territory divides, roads connect. Now they needed recognition. Ari sent out invitations. 7 kingdoms, 5 baronies, 3 free cities, 2 trade unions. The signing of the road convention. In a month. On the hill at the intersection of 3 highways. While they waited, Dan ran into someone he'd been expecting for a long time. Corvin Drain, master of the Guild of Old Caravanners. He arrived at night, alone, without guards, unarmed, with a small satchel. He asked for a meeting, in person. They sat in Dan's tent. A candle burned. Songhua stood behind the curtain. Dan hadn't called for her. She came on her own. Corvin Drain was old, 60 years old, lean, upright, well-groomed hands, silver hair combed years ago, eyes sharp as a hawk's. He drank tea. Dan drank tea. They were silent. Then Corvin spoke. He spoke quietly and politely, no threats, no accusations. He spoke like a man who had lost and knew it. He said that Dan had destroyed his world. Not the whole world. His world. The world of the Caravanners Guild. 3 centuries of knowledge of the roots. 3 centuries of monopoly. 3 centuries of power based on the fact that no one but them could guide a caravan from point to point. Dan had rendered that knowledge useless. Any fool could now travel the road, without a guide, without a map, following the stones Dan had laid. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. Corvin continued. He said he didn't regret the incident with the overseer in Graysmore, because it was war, and in war people get killed. But he admits he lost. The Caravanners Guild is falling apart. The guides are leaving. The clients are leaving. The money is leaving. In a year, the guild will be gone. He proposed a deal, a final one. The Caravanners Guild joins the Guild of the Roads. As a division, former guides become road inspectors, patrolmen, station supervisors. They know the routes. They know the people. They know the dangers. These are useful skills. Even on new roads, Dan thought, for a long time, in silence. Corvin waited. Then Dan said he accepted. On one condition. Corvin pays for the supervisor. Not with money, with action. Personally. Every month. He comes to the station in Graysmore and works as a station attendant for 1 day, for the rest of his life. Corvin looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, stood up, finished his tea, and headed for the exit. He turned around at the threshold, said he liked Dan, that it was a shame they hadn't met sooner, under different circumstances. Dan replied that circumstances are created by people. Corvin smiled and left. Songhua came in after he left. She asked why Dan had welcomed an enemy. Dan replied that there are no former enemies. There are people who have found their place and people who haven't. Corvin has found his now. Songhua was silent. Then she said one sentence. She said that in 2 years of service, not a single commander had asked her opinion on matters unrelated to combat, except for Dan, who asks every day. Dan looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the candle. And her face, which had always been stony, was soft. For the first time. Dan wanted to say something. he didn't. Because he didn't know what. The day of the convention had arrived. The 7 kingdoms had sent representatives. 3 had sent their kings in person. All the barons had arrived. The trading houses had sent their heads. The Church of the Long Winter had sent an observer. The archbishop hadn't come, but he had sent someone. That was a good sign. An observer, not an inquisitor. Dan didn't lead them into a hall. There was no hall. He led them along the road, on foot, up a high hill, that very one, at the intersection of 3 roads. On the hill stood a table made of planks. On the table was a map of the continent. Dan placed 7 candles on the map, in the places where the capitals stood, and he said, "We'll light them one by one. If even one doesn't light, it means that road isn't needed." Mira lit the first one, Brynmore, the village where it all began. Evelyn lit the second one, Loaven, where the fish no longer rot in the harbor. Hannah lit the third, Stone Ridge, where stonemasons are building bridges again. Songhua lit the fourth, Caldor, where children no longer go hungry. Ari lit the fifth, the capital of Earthania, which tried to subdue the road and failed. Yinjie lit the sixth, Norgard, a small, proud land that, for the first time in 80 years, trades with its neighbors. Dan lit the seventh, the center of the map, the place where the imperial capital once stood, beneath the glacier. 7 lights burned in the wind, on an empty hill, where there was nothing but a road stretching off in all directions. One of the kings quietly told his neighbor that they had just sworn allegiance to a man without a throne or an army. The neighbor replied that they had sworn allegiance to the road, and he was its guardian. Everyone signed the treaty. The Guild of Roads was recognized as an independent institution, neutral territory, its own tolls, its own standards, its own security, its own law. Dan stood next to Mira. He watched the candlelight, and for the first time in 2.5 years, he wasn't thinking about the next stretch of road. Not about stone and gravel. Not about switchbacks and tunnels. He was thinking about the turn in Oregon. The turn that killed him. The ceremony for the bridge across Grey Winds took place 2 weeks after the convention was signed. The 3 kingdoms sent delegations. Bards arrived from 5 cities, merchants, pilgrims, onlookers. Hundreds of people stood on both banks of the gorge and waited. The wind blew in their faces, the chains hummed, the milestone stones on the pylons glowed brightly, because thousands of people had crossed the bridge in the past 2 months, and every one of them was grateful. Everyone was waiting for the ceremonial speech. Dan stepped to the edge of the gorge. He coughed. He looked at the people. Then he said he wanted Martha Helvin to be the first to cross the bridge today. The crowd fell silent. Few knew that name. Dan explained. 8 years ago, Martha's husband was transporting goods across the gorge, over a pontoon bridge. The ropes gave way. The pontoon capsized. Her husband fell into the abyss. His body was found 2 days later on the rocks by the river. Martha hadn't been to his grave since, because the grave is on the other side, and there's no crossing anymore. Martha stood in the crowd, an ordinary woman, not young, wearing a simple headscarf, with the red hands of someone who has spent her whole life and carried water. She didn't want to go. The people around her were pushing her. She shook her head. Then she looked up. She looked at the bridge, at the chains stretching across the gorge, at the deck swaying in the wind. And she walked, alone, 200 meters, in complete silence. The wind tugged at her headscarf. The planks creaked beneath her feet. The chains hummed. The roadstones on the pylons glowed brighter. Alvin stood by the pylon, his eyes wet. He said later that the stones had sensed it. Martha reached the middle of the bridge. She stopped, placed her hand on the railing. She looked down. 300 meters. The river below. Rocks. Somewhere down there, 8 years ago, her husband had died. She stood there for a long time. A minute, 2, 3. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to have died down. Then Martha took her hand away. She straightened up and walked on. She reached the other bank, turned around, and walked back, slowly, calmly, like a person who had finally finished a journey that had been too long. She approached Dan, looked at him, and said 2 words. "Thank you, Master." Dan nodded. He said nothing, because a lump in his throat wouldn't let him. Then the bridge was opened to everyone. People poured through, carts, horses, merchants with bundles, children who ran ahead of their parents, squealing with delight and fear. The bridge swayed and creaked. The chains held, the planks held, the stone held. Dan stood to the side and watched. Mira approached. She stood beside him, silently. Then she said the tapestry would be beautiful. Dan didn't understand. Mira explained that one of the bards was already writing a ballad, that a merchant from Loch Haven had commissioned the tapestry. Martha on the bridge, 200 meters above the abyss. Dan grimaced. He said it was just polite talk. Mira smiled. She said he always says that, and that it's never true. That evening, the 6 of them sat in Dan's tent. 7, counting Alvin, Mira, Hana, Songhua, Ari, Evelyn, Yinjie, and Dan. The campfire was burning. The wind had died down. The stars were bright and foreign. Dan still hadn't gotten used to the local constellations. They were silent, drinking tea. Ari was doing some calculations by candlelight. Hana was sharpening a knife. Songhua sat by the entrance and listened to the night. Evelyn was wiping her glasses, the same crooked, cloudy glasses. Dan never found a good glassblower. But he found a stone-cutting master in Stone Ridge. Rock crystal lenses. Not perfect, but better. He gave them to Evelyn 3 days ago. She didn't say anything. She just put them on, then took off the old ones, put them in her pocket, and smiled all day. Not at Dan. She just smiled, because she could see the world clearly, for the first time in years. Mira was sitting closest to him. Her notebook lay on her lap. 3 notebooks now. No, 4. Blueprints, reports, standards, and something personal. She didn't show the 4th one to anyone. Dan didn't ask. Inji unfolded a map, a large one. It covered the entire tent. An imperial map superimposed over Dan's map. Old routes in red, new ones in green. There wasn't much green. 360 kilometers of the triangle, plus the Bryn Mawr Star, plus the Baron's route, plus the roads to Lowhaven. In total, just over 500 kilometers. The imperial network was 12,000. 500 out of 12,000. 4%. Dan looked at the map and thought, 2.5 years, 500 kilometers. It would take another 60 years to restore the network, at the current pace. He wouldn't live to see it. But the world is already building itself. Tarek is managing his section. Bran died last month, quietly, in his sleep. His nephew is building bridges. Hana trained 4 masons. They'll train others. Evelyn set up 3 medical posts along the route. Ari established toll standards that operate without her supervision. Songhua assembled a 60-person unit. Yinjie deployed a network of agents across half the continent. Olvin found 2 apprentices who are already setting road markers on their own. Dan didn't build roads. Dan built people who build roads, and that was more important than any road. Olven coughed. Everyone looked at him. The old man was silent for a long time. Then he said he had something to tell them. About the system. About the long winter. About everything. He spoke for an hour, quietly, slowly, like a man who had kept a secret for 70 years and could finally let it go. The system of paths was not created by humans. It was part of Velgard itself, embedded in the continent as the circulatory system is embedded in the body. It existed before humans. When humans arrived, the system found the one who could work with it, the first road builder. He built the first trails. His apprentice built the first bridges. 1,000 years later, imperial road builders created a network that connected the entire continent. The system was passed from bearer to bearer, not by blood, by calling. It chose those who thought about roads, who saw the path, who understood that civilization is the ability to reach your neighbor. The last bearer before Dan was the great road builder of the Cetrian Empire. His name has been lost. His roads stood for 300 years. Then the long winter came. And Olven said what Dan had both hoped for and feared. The long winter was no accident. It was a strike, a targeted one, organized. Someone had found a way to destroy the road network in a single stroke, to sever the magical arteries, to bring down bridges, to bury mountain passes, to cut cities off from one another, and to kill the system's bearer. The great roadmaster perished on the first day of winter. The system fell asleep for 300 years. Who was behind it? Alvin didn't know the name. He only knew that the organization still existed, the Nameless Order. They believe that a connected world is dangerous, that roads give too much power to whoever controls them, that fragmentation is a defense against tyranny, that a world where no one can reach their neighbor is better than a world where one person can reach everyone. Dan listened, and he understood the logic. Twisted, but logic. If whoever controls the roads controls everything, then destroying the roads is an act of freedom, in their understanding. A monstrous, crippled freedom that kills children. But freedom. Alvin said that the Order knew about Dan, that they were watching, that the first envoy would arrive soon, maybe already on the way. Dan asked what they wanted. Alvin replied, they wanted him to destroy the system, voluntarily, because if he doesn't destroy it, they'll bring about a new winter. The tent was silent. The fire crackled. The wind rustled the fabric. Then Dan stood up. He walked over to the map. He looked at the 500 green kilometers among the 12,000 red ones. And he said no. Not because he's brave, not because he was stubborn, because they were wrong. Roads don't give power to one. Roads give opportunity to all. Martha crossed the bridge not because Dan ordered her to, but because the bridge stands, and anyone can cross it. A new winter is impossible if there are enough roads, if the network is redundant, if every route can be bypassed, if every bridge has an alternative. This is a basic principle of engineering, fault tolerance. The system can withstand the loss of any node as long as the rest are working. We must not destroy the system. We must build a network that cannot be destroyed with a single blow. And to do that, we must build more, faster, wider. Not alone, everyone. Dan turned to his people, to the 6 women and the old mage, to those who built with him, who calculated, who healed, who guarded, who mapped, who traded, who remembered. And he said that tomorrow they would begin the 4th route, and the 5th, and the 6th, all at once, because now they had people, knowledge, money, standards, a guild, and time. Not endless, but enough. He won't wait for the order. He will build Because every kilometer of road is a kilometer that cannot be taken away, that will remain, that will work,
along which a grandmother will travel to her sister, along which a child will be taken to the doctor, along which fish will reach to those who are starving. He is an engineer. He builds. That is all he knows how to do, and all he needs. In the morning, Dan stepped out of the tent. The sun was rising over the mountains. The road stretched southward. It glistened in the morning light. The milestones faded one by one, yielding to the sun. For the last time, Dan remembered that turn. Icy, dark, from which he had fallen to his death and woken up in the mud with a shovel in his hands. He wasn't angry at that turn anymore, because that turn had brought him here, to these roads, to these people, to this morning. Mira came out of the neighboring tent, stretched, saw him, walked over, held out a notebook, a fresh one, the 5th. On the first page, written in her neat, clear handwriting, was Route 4, Lowhaven and Fairholme, Preliminary Survey. Dan took the notebook, opened it. He looked at the drawings, then at Mira. She stood before him, 21 years old, freckled, with scraped knees, with eyes in which burned the same flame as 2.5 years ago by the well in Bryn Mawr. Only now it was not the flame of a girl who wanted to learn, but of a woman who knew how to build. Dan nodded. He picked up the shovel, that very one, the first one, with a wooden handle and an iron blade. It had been with him from the very beginning, and he set off down the road, forward, toward the next kilometer, because the road never ends. The road goes on, always.